There we go. All right. So my name is Fernando Reimers. I'm a professor of the practice of international education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to the 2022 conference on global education. The theme of this year's conference is building the futures of education. And the reason that is the theme is because the conference is connected to the recently published UNESCO report on the futures of education. So what's going to happen today, let me just see, is that you're going to hear both today and tomorrow presentations of work done by students in the course Education Policy Analysis and Research in Comparative Perspective that I teach at the Graduate School of Education that I taught last semester. And working in teams and consulting for education authorities in various jurisdictions, various levels of government, municipal, state, and national level around the world, students use this recent framework produced by the International Commission on the Futures of Education, put together by UNESCO, to examine in those jurisdictions what were the salient education challenges, education problems, what efforts were ongoing to address them, and then to identify opportunities to change. Throughout the semester, they discuss that work with their clients, in most cases, secretaries of education or leaders of education networks. And today, they are presenting that work here for your feedback. I want to thank, first of all, the students for their excellent and dedicated work, and the 5 teaching fellows who taught this course with me last semester and who are with us today for their very dedicated support to the students who are presenting the work today. And they are Tanya Butler, Idia Irele, Charlie Kenyon, Catherine Pitcher, and Stephanie Ovid. I also want to thank the education authorities who agreed to work with the students serving as their clients, many of whom will be with us today discussing these papers. And so I want to thank all the discussants who include current and past ministers of education, as well as education specialists in UNESCO and in other organizations. The way the day is going to flow is we're going to have half an hour dedicated for the presentation and discussion of each of the papers. First, some members of the team who wrote that paper will summarize that work for you, taking about 10 minutes. Then we will hear from the discussants of that work, in most cases, one person, but on a few cases, there will be 2 discussants, and they will take about 10 minutes. And then we will have 10 minutes for your questions. To make your questions, please use the Q&A function, which you can see on your Zoom screen. Just write your question, and the discussant, the presenters themselves, will read your questions and address them. I want to say a word about the particular pedagogical approach which produces the work we're seeing today. This approach reflects a philosophy that honors the view that in order for students to develop authentic, deeper knowledge, it's very important that they engage in solving real problems of practice, not in contemplating problems, but in actually trying to generate solutions to problems. And that's what the papers that you're hearing today do. They take the challenge of how to improve the opportunities for students to gain an education that is relevant to the needs of the 21st century in the very challenging context created by the COVID-19 pandemic. And they use the UNESCO framework to examine what is being done to provide those opportunities and what could be done better. In addition to reflecting that view that deeper learning results from project problem-based learning that engages students in finding solutions to problems rather than contemplating, I'm committed to the idea that universities have a very important outreach mission, which is as important as the mission of teaching and research, and which can be integrated with those 2 other missions, producing synergies that help the university become true engines of social and economic development of the communities of which they are a part. And the COVID COVID-19 pandemic makes that outreach mission even more important. This pandemic has transformed and disrupted life with a lot of costs, with a lot of negative consequences for much of humanity. And it would be really, really important if the 28,000 universities that exist around the world embraced the responsibility and the opportunity of being part of the process of building back better, of not only mitigating and alleviating this harm caused by the pandemic, but actually helping build societies that are more inclusive, that are more sustainable. And that is exactly the vision of the UNESCO report. And I want to say a word about that report. In its almost 8 decades history, UNESCO has 3 times put together independent commission of experts who are not staff of UNESCO to think about the future, to think about the challenges of the future, and to produce frameworks that challenge, that provoke reflection on how to educate students to build that future. The first time UNESCO did that was in 1968, when it put together the commission chaired by Edgar Faure that produced a report, Learning the Treasure Within. The big idea of that report, that produced the report, Learning to Be. The big idea of that report was that it was essential for education to prepare people for lifelong learning. The second time UNESCO did that was in 1992, when it asked Jacques Delors, former chairman of the European Commission, to chair a commission that produced a report, Learning the Treasure Within. The big idea of that report was that education needed to embrace a multidimensional view of the goals of education to prepare students for a world that was changing very rapidly. This commission, put together by Assistant Director of Education Stefania Giannini and by Director General of UNESCO Audrey Azoulay, and chaired by the President of Ethiopia, has produced a report that was released in November that differs from the 2 previous reports in a number of several important ways. The first one is the 2 previous reports are addressed largely to governments. The assumption of those reports is that educational change happens when governments decide that education should change. This report, in contrast, is addressed to every student, to every teacher, to every school administrator, to members of society at large, to every human on this planet, under the assumption that if a culture of education is going to change, this is going to require collaboration, learning together, and a commitment to act together to transform the larger educational ecosystem. So this report is not a blueprint for change, but an invitation for dialogue. The kind of dialogue that the students who are presenting work today have engaged with in education authorities, and the kind of dialogue that we are engaging with all of you today. It is the hope of this commission that as many of these dialogues take place in a variety of educational institutions and in a variety of social institutions, it will be those conversations where local stakeholders examine the relevance, the salience of those ideas for their local context, and where they build on their strengths of their systems and of those institutions. It'll be as a result of that process that the culture of education can be transformed. There is another way in which this report differs from the 2 previous reports. These reports places a much bigger bet, has much greater hope for the role that universities can play in facilitating that change. In the first report, universities were given 2 lines of the entire report. In the second report, they were given 3 pages. In this report, universities are mentioned in every single section of the report, not only as an invitation to transform the way in which universities themselves carry out their missions of research, of teaching, of outreach, but inviting universities to engage with the rest of the education system, with other educational institutions for the purpose of building greater collective capacity, and in this way, rise up to the challenges of preparing students for the future. This report proposes a systemic transformation of education along 5 dimensions: pedagogy, curriculum, the organization of schools, the teaching profession, and the construction of a system of lifelong learning. And the report envisions 4 processes that can produce that transformation. First, the kind of social dialogue that we're having today. Second, in innovation and research. None of the previous reports makes as big a bet on innovation and research as this one does. Third, universities. And lastly, a reimagined system of global collaboration and international collaboration. So with that as a way of setting that context, it is now my great honor and privilege to invite Stefania Giannini, Assistant Director General for Education at UNESCO, and who in many ways is the architect of the process that brought this report about. She is responsible, perhaps because she was a university professor and a president of a university, for the fact that half of the members of this commission are faculty members, researchers, and education leaders in universities. And I think it is in great part thanks to her vision that this report is one that invites dialogue, that invites a broad social dialogue in which the voices of many people, including and especially students, will shape the futures of education. So without further ado, let me now invite Stefania to join us. I hope that you are right here. Yes, here you are. And I think if we could stop sharing the screen so that everybody can see Stefania. Stefania, thank you so much for making time for us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, dear Fernando, Professor Reimers, and students, colleagues. I see a very international virtual room, so it's a great pleasure for me to have the opportunity to address you as you start out on 2 days of conversations, on a range of important conversations on the futures of education. I just heard your brilliant presentation of the report, so I can go straight to the point and share with all of you some ideas, a vision from UNESCO about the role of the process that you are very much building on, and thanks for that. Thanks for this engagement. Well, for those of you who are joining this for the first time, I can tell you that you are in an extraordinary, rich set of discussions, inspiring discussions between theory and practice. Last September, by the way, I had the opportunity to speak with the students who are presenting their work here. And I know for sure, as university professor, as Fernando just mentioned, that we can expect a rich dialogue between current and future global education leaders. And it's also an additional great pleasure on the part of UNESCO that the recently released flagship of the House, the report Reimagining Our Futures Together, a new social contract for education, has served as one of the key reference documents for the presentations to come over the next 2 days. As you know, Professor Reimers was one of the value members of this International Commission on the Futures of Education that produced this extraordinary report over an intense 2-year period. And importantly, from my perspective, and very relevant, I suppose, to this conference, in addition to the intellectual leadership of the 17 members of the Commission, including mostly the chair, Madam Salework, currently President of Ethiopia, over 1 million people from all around the world were involved in consulting and, let me say, co-creating the initiative. And this is maybe the difference between the other 2 milestone flagships of UNESCO, the report, the FORE report, and the law report already just mentioned and described, illustrated by in the substance and the purpose by Professor Reimers. So all those all those external contributors, over million people, actually share their hopes, their fears, their inspiration, also their concerns, and offer ideas in focus group discussions through online platforms, polls, surveys, webinars, and meetings. And this is what technology now actually allow us to do, and that's maybe the idea of having, as Professor Reimers already mentioned, not a kind of blueprint, but an open document which can really drive, inspire dialogue and co-creation of a dynamic movement for education in the coming months and years. And I think that what we have now in this report is a kind of source of inspiration. I find it honestly very elegant, very concrete in its recommendations for transforming education that can transform the world. I think the key word, if you ask me which are the key two messages I take from this very well articulated conversation paper, which is about addressing all the main dimensions of education, from pedagogies, curriculum, teachers and teaching, the role of technology, the role of education to address the current challenges, from climate change to hate speech and so on. But I see really two dimensions I wish to highlight. One is about the learning to care. I would say that if learning to be has been the key message of the FOR report, I would say that from this report, the key message for all educators, community of education, but all readers around that, is about taking care of the planet, taking care of each other, taking care of a new relationship between human kind and technology. And I think that this can really bring additional new inspirations in addressing the current challenges of these times, including the pandemic and including the impact of the pandemic. And the second point I see as a very interesting, maybe a real new one, is about the role of transformation through and in education. Transforming education is also the main purpose of SDG 4, is the ambitious action plan which is behind 2030 agenda as a whole, and the role of knowledge production and the leadership, the intellectual leadership, which political leadership is also asked to take, is very much on top of this discussion. So I think that engaging in dialogue and action together is a bit at the center of this idea of building a new social contract for education, and ensuring also a broad democratic participation is another essential dimension. I mean, these are the main important highlights I see, and I'm sure that your contribution to this discussion will be very important for all of us in the follow-up. I thank you very much, Fernando, and I'm very sorry I have to leave for a next meeting, but I really appreciate your contribution and your students and experts' contribution to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefania, for being with us today. I want to recognize your deep commitment to students, how generous you are. Whenever I've invited you to address student conversations, you're always there if you can make it. And I want to announce that Stefania has agreed to write the preface for a book at which we're going to be publishing the work presented today. So thank you so much, Stefania, for being with us. So I think without further ado, we're going to proceed with the rest of the conference. So for those of you who are just joining, let me remind you that we are recording this conference. And so for the purpose that those of you in different time zones can follow them up, what we're going to do is we're going to devote 30 minutes to each paper that will be presented. Some members of that team are going to devote about 10 minutes to summarize the paper. Then we're going to hear from a discussant of the paper for another 10 minutes. And then all of you attending will have an opportunity to raise your questions using the Q&A function. If you just click on Q&A, you can type your questions and the presenters will be able to read them and will address them. So I think that without further ado, we are a little bit ahead of schedule, which is always good. And we're just going to proceed to the first paper. We are now going to hear from the team that wrote a paper on the city of Bogota. And here you have the schedule. Let's just stay on the schedule for a moment so that you see the plan for today. We are going to hear from a team that, using UNESCO's vision of the futures of education, examine the education challenges of Bogota and the ongoing efforts to address those challenges, and then makes recommendations. I want to say that it's been a privilege to work with the Education Secretary of Bogota, Edna Bonilla, and with her team in these and other endeavors. And I know that they are very much looking forward to this report, because they are, I believe, the very first city in the world that engage with this report in the kind of inclusive, democratic, participatory dialogue that the Commission envisioned. So I'm hoping that this report is going to be useful to their efforts. And we are delighted that the person who's going to be the discussant for this paper is Cecilia Maria Velez, who's a good friend of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, a former visiting professor here, but who was an education secretary of Bogota many years ago, and subsequently Secretary of Education of Colombia. And in those roles, she cultivated an entire generation of new education leaders in that country. After we hear from them, we will hear from, I will be introducing them as the time comes, from teams who are going to present an analysis of educational efforts in Palestine. Then we're going to hear from a team that is going to present an analysis of efforts ongoing in the school district of Central Falls, Rhode Island. Then we're going to hear from a team that is going to present a particular program to support marginalized students in completing high school in Israel, the MBR EDGAR program. Then we're going to hear from a team that is going to analyze ongoing educational efforts in Mongolia. Then we will hear from a team that is going to talk about education efforts ongoing in South Africa. Then we'll hear from a team that is going to present efforts ongoing in the state of Nuevo León in Mexico. And we're going to conclude the morning with an analysis of education efforts in the state of Jalisco, Mexico. And tomorrow we will meet again from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. for another round of presentations. So without further ado, let me invite the team that is going to present the education reform in Bogota paper to the stage. Come in.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
All right, thank you. My name is Mackenzie Bonner, and I'm joined by my colleagues Yunmi Kang, Lijuan Lee, and Yoli Liu. Our paper is entitled Education Reform in Bogota, 2020 to 2024, Existing Challenges and Recommendations. Next slide, please. So Bogota's district development plan outlines 28 goals under the jurisdiction of the Secretary of Education, SED for short, that aim to advance education in the 21st century. The overarching theory of action behind these goals are to recover from loss related to the COVID-19 pandemic, reduce social discrimination, protect human rights, and finally promote equity. So in our paper, we analyze the extent to which Bogota's ongoing education reform aligns with the UNESCO Future of Education report. Next slide, please. So we gathered information on Bogota's past and current reforms through multiple sources listed on the slide, including interviews as well as primary and secondary data. We then analyzed potential areas of improvement within Bogota's education system and made recommendations for the ongoing reform. Next slide, please. So as we've heard in the introduction to this conference, the UNESCO Future of Education report aims to improve and transform education globally. Overall, we concluded that Bogota's reform aligns with all 5 domains outlined in the UNESCO report. Domain 1 relates to the pedagogy of cooperation and solidarity. The SED has 3 efforts related to this domain, including socio-emotional programs in schools to promote mental health and well-being, targeting the most vulnerable students. Domain 2 relates to the curriculum and evolving knowledge commons. So the SED has 5 efforts related to this domain, including the Girls and Boys Educate Adults program, which promotes civic education and allows young students to participate in city planning. Domain 3 consists of the transformative work of teachers. So the SED has 3 efforts related to this domain, including professional learning networks across schools, nurseries, research and innovation groups. Domain 4 relates to safeguarding and transforming schools. The SED has 2 efforts related to this domain, striving to transform schools into territories of peace, an initiative that also aligns with Domain 1. And then finally, Domain 5 relates to education across different time and spaces. And the SED has 3 efforts related to this domain, including strengthening family and school relationships and ensuring that all students have a right to education. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the reform aligns with all 5 domains of the UNESCO report. Yet we identified 3 prevailing challenges in Bogota's existing education system that may impede reform. So the first key challenge we identified relates to secondary education, specifically low enrollment and completion rates at the basic secondary level, and then the non-compulsory upper secondary level. In Bogota, according to EXceed data, less than 60% of students enrolled in upper secondary education in 2020, which has significant implications for the higher education sector, as well as the labor market. So the second challenge we identified relates to prevailing gaps between rural and urban schools. We found that students in rural areas have a lack of access to information and communication technologies at home, and there are lower levels of parental involvement in children's education. Students in rural areas also experience higher repetition and dropout rates in urban areas. And according to the results of Saber 11 tests, which is the National Standardized High School Exit Exam, rural schools scored 14 points lower than the urban schools across all tested subjects. And then finally, we found that Venezuelan migrant students experience a variety of barriers to education in Bogota, which include distance and availability of transport to schools, the need to work to supplement family income, and limited knowledge of the education system. Additionally, for those who do attend school, they report increased experiences of discrimination and a lack of socio-emotional support. I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Yoli.
Thank you, Mackenzie. Next slide, please. In order to resolve the above 3 key challenges, we studied Bogota's existing efforts with respect to its current reform and made a specific recommendation for each challenge. Firstly, to shorten gaps in secondary education enrollment and completion, the cash transfer pilot program provided payment to students following the attendance requirements. The school mobility program helps students get to school, and the Young People with Abilities program aimed to promote positive outcome for youth in grade 10 and 11. Despite these practices, SED still has limited data. we recommend that the SED commission a citywide dropout survey to inform future planning and strategic intervention. It would be valuable to gain a deeper insight into secondary education, along with students' race, economic status, migration status, etc. And the data would enable the SED to allocate resources and capacity towards targeted interventions for students who may be most at risk of dropping out. Secondly, Bogota also plans to guarantee that both rural and urban children have equal rights to receive a high-quality education. The policy has included 6 guidelines to promote the needs of rural students from preschools to higher education. It aims to implement quality education in 100% rural schools. To continue this effort, we recommend an investment in virtual networks between high-quality urban teachers and rural students. This investment could allow students to receive high-quality education either at school or at home without commuting to urban areas. Bogota could achieve this practice by building off of the existing program that provided digital technologies to all students during the pandemic. Thirdly, to provide access to education for displaced students, the Colombian government makes efforts to facilitate access to social services for Venezuelan migrants. Colombia has passed a law to make civil documentation requirements more flexible. Bogota also plans to construct schools as territories of peace through efforts such as implementing civic education programs in all public schools. As Bogota continues its efforts, we recommend mobilizing displaced Venezuelan adults as teaching staff within the school system. We also suggest that all teachers in Bogota could receive social justice-focused training. It would enable the teachers to prevent bullying occurring at school and support Venezuelan students more effectively. Next slide, please. So the 2 recommendations outlined here focus on the importance of collaboration and partnerships. We made these recommendations in order to address all the 3 challenges we mentioned before and reduce the education inequality in the city. We recommend that schools could provide a welcoming climate for parents and encourage them to partnership with teachers. For example, schools could offer co-constructed lessons with parents, parental volunteer activities and workshops, so parents could monitor their children's learning at home. We also recommend that Bogota could continue its existing partnerships with other governmental districts, which could reduce the barrier to employment for students' families. It could also continue to work with the private sector to fill the digital accessibility gap and promote the resource inadequacy, particularly in rural schools. Next slide, please. As you may see in this slide, we made 5 recommendations in total. They all align with the domains outlined by the UNESCO report. The first recommendation aligns with domain 5. The second and the third reflects both domain 3 and 4. The fourth and the fifth aim to address domain 1. To conclude, we hope to see the current trends of the ongoing Bogota's reform undisturbed. Thank you all for listening. We appreciate your interest in our work and look forward to our conversations and your feedback.
Julie, thank you very much for that presentation. We are now going to hear from former Minister of Education, Cecilia Maria Velez. Cecilia, are you here with us?
Yes, I am.
Can we spotlight you? Let's see. Here you are.
Yes, I am here. I'm not sure you are hearing me.
Yes, we can hear you very well, Cecilia. Thank you so much.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you for the invitation. It was really very interesting to read your paper, to know what even the Secretary of Education is doing, that is really very interesting. And I enjoy a lot reading it. I have some comments. Well, first of all, I have to tell you that it's a very good work about the alignment of Bogota governmental plan with the 5 domains described by UNESCO. It's really, really very good, very good and very concrete work. I also agree with the challenges that you have defined as the challenges ahead. I think that I have some more, but I think that I agree with the definition of the challenge that you have made. And I think that the recommendation that you made, additionally to answer to the components that UNESCO had defined, they also are clear and feasible. I think that they are very interesting. Saying that, I'm going to do some general consideration about like methodology and things like that. It maybe could be the object of a later discussion. I want to ask you what you describe as a reform. I think that you are speaking about the District Development Plan 2010-2024. And I think it's different to speak about the reform than to speak about a development plan. There are some issues that can be defined as reforms, but I think that the overall picture is of a development plan, not of a reform. And it's very interesting as a subject of discussion, of a general discussion in the course, I think. That is one first point. The second point is about the figures. It's really very difficult to work. You did a good research work, but sometimes it's difficult to be precise in the figures. And knowing that the countries have different ways of seeing things or say things that are not exactly what you expect. I was really thinking about the per capita spending in Bogota. You said it's $400. I say, no, that's not true. I went to the observatory, and what I find out is that you have all this, the expenditure. It's not really all, but the mainly expenditure divided of all the enrollment. And really, this is the public expenditure, is only the public expenditure. Then, if you are going to do a per capita expenditure over all the enrollment, you have to sum up the private expenditures. That's why when I saw, I say 400. And when I did the division among the number of the public enrollment, it gave me 1,200. And it's a different to speak about 400 or 100 and 1,000 and 200. And that's why, and finally I find out that was because you didn't take into account the private expenditure, but really is something that you don't see very easily, because as in Bogota, you have a very big enrollment in the private sector. I think that could be, it diminished in the last 2 decades, but I think that is like 40%. Then you have to sum up the private expenditure. I don't know if I was clear, but maybe later I can be more clear. There is another point about the figures, that is unit you use for the money. In the subsidy, you spoke about 30, but I didn't know it was dollars or it was pesos. And you have to be clear about that, because it says 30 or 30,000 pesos is the subsidy. I think that is 30,000 pesos. And you spoke about 30 or things like that, 150 or 150,000, that if they are in pesos, then there are figures that you have to be more concrete or be more clear in the definition. Maybe you can put all the components of the formula. And other thing are the concept that sometimes you apply, thinking maybe in another national conception. For example, decentralization. Decentralization in Colombia is tricky because we have very centralized the expenditure, not the expenditure, the amount of money allocated is very central. The central government distributes the money among the local administrations, and we have the laws are very centralized, but we have this administrative or management decentralization towards the regions. And Bogota especially is a region that has money, that has its own money and have more capacity. But you cannot speak about a federal government. And and this conception can have can change or may like make you do more precisions in your recommendations. For example, when you speak about make compulsory high school or secondary education, you are speaking about the function that is from the national government, not from the local government. I think that you maybe say something like that they have to lead the way towards a compulsory education in secondary, and maybe that could be okay. But sometimes you speak about the federal government. We don't have federal government. Then there are like 3 precisions that you can make in your work. Now, I have some consideration about the challenges that, as I said, they are very well defined. And you define like 2 groups that are really very unequally treated, that are the rural population and the Venezuelan migrants. Maybe there is a bigger challenge for Colombia and for Bogota, that is, generally speaking, the differences among the education that we offer to the citizen or to the students, because we have a big differences between a very good quality of some private and even some public schools, and generally speaking, we have a very bad education, not only for the rural areas, not only for the migrants, if not for the less or more poor students. Then we have like the big challenges in quality, generally speaking, even in Bogota. Well, you choose two groups that are very representative of the problem now. And I agree that they are really very segregated, but the inequality, I am not going to be able to say, the difference in quality of education in Bogota is really, as in Colombia in general, is really a big challenge. Now, I'm going to refer to each one of the challenges. You are speaking about the enrollment and completion rates, and and you do a recommendation, and you say it is necessary to do another survey and to see what is the situation of the problem. But you always also say that there are many studies about why people drop out, or for why students drop out. Then I think that to make another survey is not necessary. I think that we need to use the information that we have. Colombia have improved a lot the information system, and Bogota especially did. And I think that all the variables that explain dropout are in the education, in the system, in the system of the system of the sector. And I think that what we have to do, and even to improve the information system, is to use it, and to use it with artificial intelligence, with machine learning, and, for example, to use these models that had been applied in the United States, and even here in universities, we use them, is those models to define the risk of dropout. If you have this information, and you give this information to the teachers of the DU dropout warning systems, then if you give that information to the teacher and let them and teach them how to use this information, it's going to be, I think, very effective, because they can take action to stop the dropout, or to prevent the dropout. And it also is useful for the secretary to focalize the problems within the different institutions. Then I think that using the information that we have, and obviously when you use it, you improve it, I think that it's going to be very more effective. In the second, or in front of the second challenge, that is to bridge the rural and urban education. I agree with the two recommendations. The teacher training, more than the teaching training, you spoke about the use of technology. I think that is a good proposal, and using good teachers, because one of the problems of the rural area are that you don't have very good teachers that want to go there. But then I think that you have to put incentives to good teachers to go there. And I think that is one additional recommendation that we'll give to Bogota. We need to have better teachers in the rural areas. Obviously, technology, as you said, and the relationship, the network with good teachers in the urban areas are going to be useful, but I think that we need better teachers. And another thing that we need in the rural area, you speak about like an institutional problem, and I think that is a big problem, because we don't have a good organization of the schools, because we have sometimes one rector or one principal for several little schools, and it's not real an institution, and then they don't have the advice, or they don't have the things that they need in the school, at the little school in the rural areas. I think that we have to do a new organization, and it's not only for Bogota, it's for all Colombia, that we need to improve. We did an organization in 2000, I guess 2002, 2004 or something like that, but it was not very effective, and we have to improve that organization. But I think that the two recommendations that you gave are really very, very, very good for the rural areas. And finally, the migrants, the Venezuelan migrants, I find out extraordinary the recommendation of using Venezuelan teachers to attend institutions with migrants. I think that it would be really, really very interesting. First, because you can use teachers that are here from Venezuela. You can use this capital, this human capital here in Colombia, and they can help to make more easy the life of the Venezuelan kids, but also to compare the two curriculums to make more easy the transition. I think that is really a very innovative and interesting proposal. Well, you gave additionally some like general recommendation about promoting parental involvement is a problem in the rural areas for the three challenges. And it's really, I don't know how to do to be effective in this parental involvement with the problem of the time of the parents. Here in Bogota, the parents have to work and they have to travel a lot. You knew, I don't know if you knew, but the traffic in Bogota is terrible, and the time that they spend going to the work is really, really very important, and they literally don't have time. I think that like thinking in something like the community involvement and things like that could be a way, but I think that is a very tricky thing, because we always want to improve the parental involvement, and it's really very difficult with people that is in this kind of economic context. The second is the intergovernmental collaboration is really a challenge. It's very important and it's really a challenge. And the leverage of private-public partnership, I think that we have a lot of people doing things from the private sector, but we have to be more effective and more organized. We from the Empresarios por la Educación, we are trying to have a very good information about what the private sector do in public education, to give this information to the secretaries and to make easy the coordination between public and private action. And I would do an additional general recommendation is about the Coexistence code. I don't know if it's the exact translation. We have here like the el código de convivencia. I don't know, I translated it like a coexistence code. But I think that we have to work on that. It's a code that the institution have to define about what are the rules to live, to coexist. And there have been a lot of discussion about that. And some ministry almost fall because of this, because try to improve this coexistence code. But I think that it's very important to work on that, to make explicit the rules, to make the explicit the rules about the respect you have to have with the others, the kind of relationship that they have to do. I think that is an important opportunity to improve this code, to make schools improve in the well-being of all the educational community. And finally, evaluation. Let's see how, as you said, it's very early to see what are the changes now. We have a lot of information, and the Secretary of Education has the instruments. We will see what happened with that plan. Well, I think that are all my comment. I hope.
Cecilia, that was so wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your close reading of this paper and your very generous comments, which I know this team is going to use very effectively as they revise this paper for publication as a chapter in a book. I am delighted that we have a number of people from the Secretaría de Bogotá who are with us today. And I'd like to invite right now Helen Orjuela, who is, I'm going to ask her to join with us just for a moment because she wants to say a few words about the paper that she heard. Helen works in the Department of Education and she worked closely with this team. There you are, Helen, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Reimers, for the invitation, and to all the Harvard students team. Thank you for all the hard work that you do with us these past months, like getting to know what are we doing here in Bogota. So I got two comments that I think it's important to point out, that here in Bogota we are like putting off all of our efforts into things that maybe the team didn't have the time to review. The first one is all the policy related to higher education. I think this is one of the biggest legacies that the city will have after this administration. And it's everything related with how we improve the access to education, to higher education, to the most vulnerable communities here in Bogota. And the second one, it's that we felt really glad to hear about the recognition that the socio-emotional program is having, because it's a thing that after the pandemic, it's clearly one of the big challenges that we have in schools. So that's it. And again, thank you to the Harvard students for all the hard work.
Thank you so much, Helen, for joining us. I'm now going to invite the presenters to look at a few of the questions that are in the Q&A and then address as many as you can in the next couple of minutes. If you could just pick one or two and speak to them, Yoli and Mackenzie, that'd be great.
Maybe,
Yes.
oh, sorry, I was just going to mention the question that said how to achieve the recommendation of delivering online remote education in rural areas where there's not connectivity. Many rural areas still do not have access to internet. Maybe Yoli, if you wanted to elaborate more on that specific recommendation and explain the context of what was done elsewhere and the digital progress that's been made during the pandemic.
So firstly, I want to thank Cecilia and Helen's wonderful feedback. As Cecilia mentioned before, Bogota really have lower quality teachers as well as a lack of technological resources as compared to urban schools. So we recommend investing a virtual network between urban and rural schools to mitigate both challenges. And based on our experience and research, we found that providing monetary subsidies for high quality urban teaching personnel to relocate to rural schools was unsuccessful. This was because urban teachers tended to be reluctant due to the long distance and poor rural local conditions. So we recommend to sustain these virtual platforms that Bogota has already had, and they could allow students to receive high quality education either at school or at home without commuting to urban areas as students mostly did. And according to some of the research in other countries and cities, this kind of practice could result in a 21% drop in the pre-existing urban-rural educational gap, and there will be an increase in students' long-run labor market outcomes. And we recommend this digital technology platform in rural areas because the SED achieves this already by building off of the existing program called Learning at Home. This program was providing digital technologies and internet connectivity to all students during the pandemic. So we think they could continue this platform and connects the urban teachers and rural students. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much. Yes, it does. And we have to keep moving along. I'm sorry we don't have time to answer all the questions live, but I will invite the team of authors of this chapter to go online to the Q&A function and answer the questions in writing. At this point, I would like to invite the next team that wrote a paper on education in Palestine and how to align education efforts there with a report of UNESCO, in particular vocational education, to begin their presentation. And we are going to have, similarly a discussant at the end of this, Dr. Sergio Cárdenas, who's a specialist in lifelong learning and technical education. So please, over to you. We're ready.
Hello, and thank you, Professor Reimers. Hello, distinguished guests, and thank you for joining us today. In the past year, UNESCO launched the Futures of Education report that is a global call to reimagine the future of education. In light of this report, our research group sought to work with the Ministry of Education in Palestine to research and propose recommendations through the lens of the UNESCO report, reimagining the formal education system of TVET and centering it as a crucial tool for change in Palestine. Next slide, please. Our process for the paper consisted of interviewing ministry officials and teachers in the public education system, while also analyzing existing literature and data. Next slide, please. The context of Palestine is complex. The Ministry of Education is working in an occupied conflict zone, yet it maintains a strong vision to educate its youth and cultivate a Palestinian society that possesses values, knowledge, science, and technology, and is able to employ that knowledge for liberation as well as development. The case of Palestine provides a strong example of resilience and the promise of education in the context of political, economic, and social marginalization. Next slide, please. If we trace the education journey of a child born in Palestine today, we can see that the mandatory education only spans the age of 6 to 14 years old, with enrollment reaching as high as 99.8%. Exclusion from education and dropout is mainly in the early years and in secondary school, especially for boys. Many factors lead to secondary dropout, including violence, poverty, and low performance. It is important to note that across all levels of the system, teachers rely heavily on rote learning and teacher-centered pedagogy and assessment. Next slide, please. When we look at the whole system and the ministry's reform in alignment with UNESCO's report, 3 key aspects stand out. First, the ministry's emphasis on developing research capacity is reflected in the launching of the Education Research and Development Center in 2021, as well as their efforts to increase participation in the global tests such as PISA and TIMSS, which directly links to UNESCO's emphasis on using high-quality statistics as a tool for decision-making. Second, there's a focus on access and equity through providing non-formal education, such as TVET, and a push for online education. And third, they are committed to building teaching capacity and viewing teachers as knowledge producers. Next slide, please. Within the mentioned alignment, we also identified opportunities for growth, particularly in these 3 categories. When it comes to teacher professional development and teacher autonomy, engagement and collaboration is limited, as it is inspection-oriented. In general, collaborative vision building is limited. Moreover, the ministry's data show the prevalence of teacher-centered pedagogies and a curriculum based on rote memorization, which affect student engagement and learning. Next slide, please. One of the key issues we kept returning to in our interviews and analysis was the drastic rate of student dropout at the secondary level. We saw that TVET functioned as a net that catches these students who fall out of traditional schooling. So when thinking about how to address the issue of dropout, we arrived at TVET as the site of intervention for two key reasons. One, TVET is at the intersection of the education system and the labor market. Most of the jobs in the economy are skills-based, so TVET has more potential to meet economic needs. But at the same time, because of its non-traditional nature, there's more potential to change the curriculum and pedagogies to be related to students' pedagogies and realities. Two, the ministry invests and believes in the TVET system as a tool for change, which means that it might be easier to begin change from TVET than from the non-traditional, from the traditional secondary school system, which is culturally cemented. Next slide, please.
Despite TVET's long history in Palestinian education, and despite the ministry's investment in the program, a few key challenges emerge. First, enrollment and graduation rates are extremely low. A majority of teachers are not qualified or specialized to teach TVET, and there is strong cultural backlash against vocational education, partly because TVET is the default option for students who score poorly on their grade 10 exams and cannot enter other academic streams. Secondly, the curriculum is majorly theory-based, leaving students unprepared for the labor market. And lastly, there is a lack of complete holistic data. For example, we do not have data, official data, about what TVET graduates do once they leave the program. Next slide, please. The ministry has tried to combat many of these challenges. They introduced vocational classes for students from grades 7 to 10 to increase exposure and reduce stigma. They also added the professional competence track and the apprenticeship track in order to diversify options for TVET students and reduce dropout. Both of these newer tracks try to incorporate a more project-based approach to learning than the ordinary track, the first track, but they are detached from the final written exam structure that is linked to university admissions. And these two tracks also have much lower enrollment than the ordinary track. So it's clear that university access and lifelong learning is a big priority for TVET students and families. But the flip side, of course, is that a curriculum driven by written assessment leaves graduates unprepared for actual work in the labor market. Next slide, please. Taking these complex challenges into consideration, we developed a theory of change, and we propose that by introducing real-world and project-based learning into the curriculum across grades, and by supporting the TVET system with professional skills development, personalization, and career counseling, the Palestinian education system can produce independent learners who are prepared for the labor market, have greater access to higher education and employment opportunities, and who value diverse career paths. Next slide, please. Following from this theory of change, there are three broad components to our recommendation. The first is the introduction of project-based learning, or PBL, into grades 1 to 10. We built on the ministry's idea of introducing TVET earlier in the system, and we further proposed that schools introduce PBL instead of theory-based TVET modules for all grades. Especially if it's accompanied by holistic assessment methods, PBL has the immense potential to create a shift in cultural mindset about what learning can and should be. As communities and families watch their children create impact in the real world, they will begin to value alternative skill sets and consequently alternative career paths. Moreover, students themselves can begin to see education differently. They become more open to diverse career options and have increased self-confidence and independence of thought. And these are especially assets for a young population whose immediate surroundings are often violent and difficult. Secondly, we recommend that schools introduce career counseling in grade 10, which is the last mandatory year of schooling. Once again, the idea is to allow students and families to identify students' unique strengths and broaden perspectives on valuable career paths. The third component of our reform is to restructure TVET itself. Given that students entering the TVET program come in with a variety of goals and needs, we recommend blending the various tracks into one single personalizable track. This new track would incorporate work-based and project-based learning. It would include modules on entrepreneurship and professional skills, and offer academic coursework for certain vocational subjects on the Taujihi, or the final written exam. The rationale behind merging the tracks is twofold. One, to ensure that all students entering the TVET track have access to practical learning and practical skills that will serve them in the labor market. And two, to provide all students the chance to access Taujihi and lifelong learning if they wish to. Next slide, please. The implementation of these reforms will depend heavily on teachers' investment and motivation across the system, which, as we know, is already a challenge for the ministry. We recommend two main system-wide structural changes in TPD, or teacher professional development. The first is a change in hiring practices, which currently depends on a written exam. We recommend a more holistic assessment method to recruit teachers into the public school system. We also recommend that the ministry invest in attracting high-quality applicants for teaching positions. This is a gap in the system, as most trained teachers work in private schools. Secondly, our analysis revealed that the current structure is primarily based on monitoring and supervision and does not offer much follow-up support or personalized mentorship for teachers. And so we recommend institutionalizing a teacher coaching system. In addition, peer learning communities can be an incredible tool for teachers to learn from each other, decentralize the decision-making process at the school level, and engage in collective vision building. Next slide, please. In implementing these reforms, the ministry will likely face many other challenges, such as budgetary and staffing considerations. Given that the ministry already struggles to hire enough teachers and faces a consistent shortage in resources, it might be difficult to fully realize the vision of PBL as outlined in our recommendation. There are also environmental factors, such as the ongoing occupation and school violence, as well as cultural factors, such as communal resistance to change, that may affect the implementation and success of these reforms. Finally, even though our recommendations emphasize the need for alternative assessment methods, the Taujihi, the final written exam, it continues to be a cultural force that determines classroom culture and access to lifelong learning. As long as the structure of the Taujihi remains intact, the culture of teaching to the test can never really be fully eradicated. And these realities are important to keep in mind as we think about the next steps and the implementation of our proposed reforms for TVET in Palestine. Next slide, please. Thank you, everyone. That concludes our presentation today. We look forward to your questions and comments.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. So we now are going to hear from our discussant. I'm very appreciative to Dr. Sergio Cárdenas, who I think is going to be our discussant right now. He is a graduate of the doctoral program at the Graduate School of Education. He's a visiting scholar at the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, and he's a specialist in education and lifelong learning. He was a former director of CREFAL, a UNESCO-affiliated center on lifelong learning. And so, Sergio, thank you very much for your close reading of this paper and for your comments. Over to you.
Thank you, Fernando, and thank you, of course, to the team who wrote this paper. It is very interesting. So, of course, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to comment this paper. I think that the analysis of the implementation of TVET and lifelong learning policies is a challenging topic, and the authors did a very good job because they explain the current conditions in the Palestinian education system. We could see now in the presentation how they describe in a very detailed way the main challenges they face, obviously different from many other education systems. And also they explain how and why TVET policies in Palestine have been designed and implemented in a very specific way. I think they provide comprehensive recommendations. This is very interesting how they focus on instructional practices and the curriculum and the tracking the system has now. And I think the reader learns a lot from these issues. And of course, it's easy to see how this non-formal education correspond to the current situation and conditions in the region. I would like to point out a couple of issues that I think are very important to understand the contribution of this paper. I think one issue that we commonly found in the analysis of lifelong learning policies is an open debate about how to define the goals of non-formal education programs. Oftentimes is expressed as a contradiction. You usually see how papers argue that lifelong learning policies are only focused on, or they are based on an economics approach, where decision makers are only concerned with issues of employability. And on the other side of the debate, you can see how other scholars and researchers consider that lifelong learning policies should adopt a more humanistic perspective. They usually refuse to adopt what they call an skills-based approach. I personally think this division is artificial, but in this paper, you can see how the authors managed to include both perspectives. And I think this is very important and very useful. They do not consider TVET policies just as interventions to improve employability skills. I mean, they focus on that, but they also consider that TVET policies are an intervention aimed to shift cultural mindsets. And I think this is a compelling argument. So it is a difficult goal to do not get engaged in this artificial debate. And I think they managed to emphasize how TVET policies are, of course, programs that may support youth and students to improve their employability, but they are also a powerful educational intervention to support disadvantaged populations. So I think this is an important contribution. Of course, to achieve this is going to be important to increase the effectiveness of the TVET systems. And I think their analysis focus on that and provide a lot of recommendations or several recommendations on this issue. The second contribution of this paper is the analysis of the implementation of TVET policies. I think there is a gap in the literature about how to explain.
Yes, thank you guys.
About how to explain or analyze the implementation of lifelong learning policies. So I think they did a very good job explaining how TVET policies are implemented and how they especially describe how the flexibility of lifelong learning policies and in general, the adaptability of non-formal education programs is very useful and it becomes a helpful tool to support disadvantaged populations. I think this is very interesting and valuable. In the paper, they always focus on analyzing intervention at the education system level, but just like we see in their presentations, they are also worried and concerned about curriculum and teaching activities. They consider how ineffective practices are sources of inequalities, and this is a very valuable approach. Focus on pedagogical issues. They even suggest the adoption of project-based learning and improving professional development programs. I think these are the two main interventions they suggest. They clearly insist on how these type of interventions will help to increase the effectiveness of TVET policies. And I think they combine these issues and analysis on specific instructional activities, also system-wide decisions. For instance, they point out issues of funding. I think this is a very important issue, and it's not always analyzed with detail. I think they recognize that more data is needed. They point out this. And they make a point about potential arguments regarding efficiency of TVET policies. I think this is, I mean, the authors, again, did a very good job pointing out this issue, although we need more information, just as they explained. I also like how they present the recommendations. I think they decided to include very specific recommendations for the basic education system, for the secondary education, and also for the TVET system. They also suggest, and I think that's interesting, system-wide reforms to support TVET recommendations, mainly aimed, as they recently explained, to improve teacher quality. I only found a few issues that might be improved in the paper. We had a conversation about this with the team, and I think there are a few aspects that could be improved. One is to better align the rich agenda, including the Future of Education report, with the analysis presented in this paper. Of course, this is not a simple task, especially if you are considering non-formal education and not I would say the traditional perspective. I mean, TVET policies have different issues and it's not that so direct in some cases to link with some of the recommendations you can find in the Future of Education report. But I think there is an opportunity to include a better reflection on how the multiple goals and recommendations from this report may influence educational policies. Again, this is not a simple task, but I think there is still an opportunity to expand this discussion in the paper. Another aspect I think they may improve, this is only a suggestion, is to describe with more detail your theory of change. I think that the current version is comprehensive, but there is still an opportunity to better describe the public problem. I mean, the description of the public problem is in the paper, but I think it could be better organized to help the reader to clearly understand not just the context and the importance of the recommendations, but how these recommendations are linked to the public problem they identify. And if the group did this or is able to do this, obviously it will be easier to understand the relevance of the recommendations, the programs they suggest, and also the expected results. The other thing I think there is an opportunity to improve is that you emphasize that Tibet programs are not isolated, and the effectiveness of these policies depend on their full alignment with system-wide priorities. You suggest modifying curriculum, adopting complex instruction practices, and recognize the need to improve teacher quality. This, of course, is necessary, but it's also a very complex goal. So I will suggest that you should include issues of feasibility and point out the complexity of implementing these policies at the same time. I think this may help decision makers to understand the level of commitment they will need to support the successful implementation of Tibet policies in Palestine. I just want to congratulate the authors. This is a very interesting paper. Again, we need to learn more about the implementation of lifelong learning policies and Tibet policies. And I think their analysis is very interesting and very useful. I learned a lot from reading it, and I am sure it will be very helpful for decision makers. Thank you, Fernando.
Thank you so much, Sergio, for that close reading of the paper and for that very helpful feedback. At this point, I'm going to ask our presenters to look into the Q&A. There are a number of questions for you. And so I will ask you to pick some of them and then address them in the remaining 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this opportunity. And thank you, Dr. Cardenas, for your incredible feedback. I think, and thank you to the questions in the question and answer window as well. I think we can begin with the question about teachers and how that migration to private schools happened. And I think one sort of roadblock, and Fatma, Safa, please feel free to jump in, but I think one sort of roadblock that we found to teachers entering the public school system is that even if they go to the teachers training college and finish the program, there's still a written exam for everyone to take at the end of it that often, and because it's a written exam that tests on memory rather than sort of say your skill to be able to teach in the classroom, it's not really a surefire guarantee that the best trained teachers are passing the exam and entering the public school system. And so it happens that there's not always a guarantee of like quality candidates entering the public school system because of that bottleneck of the written exam. And I think what we suggest is reframing that exam to be more holistic, maybe to include a competency test or maybe include some aspect of getting to know the instructional, I guess, portfolio of a teacher, but basically widening the scope of how you assess teachers coming out of the teachers training college and into the public school system. And we also thought it would be helpful to invest in attracting these teachers to the public school system. And
yeah, you know, not all teachers, even if they graduate with the right skills, with the right degree, doesn't mean they enter. And that's why maybe possibly the best teachers will prefer to go to the private sector, because they know it depends on who they know and how they will do on the exam. A few teachers we talked to said they repeated the exam for many years until they could finally get in. So this is frustrating, and we didn't feel it was the right approach to attracting the highest quality and the most passionate teachers, because at the end it was an exam-based entrance. It was an entrance exam. So that's on that concern. I think the other question is about the Israeli occupation. It's the biggest concern I think we've had all throughout. And it was even starting our paper, it was like, how could we even do anything or recommend anything when there's that big thing sitting in the corner that is going to challenge everything. But I guess one thing we were very inspired by the ministry, honestly, the team we've met, the passion that they have, the understanding that the only thing they have to their resistance and continuing living is the education and the future of the possible futures of the next generations. So I think that's got us to really focus on how we could recommend, how we could focus on what needs to be done in the systems that are already working in such a complex and hard environment. So they're doing wonders, honestly, in such a situation. And all we could do is like, they've already, and even our recommendation, we're not saying build more, do things. We're saying these are already there, but how can we make them more efficient and more effective, basically? So we didn't even go ahead to recommend something beyond that would need a lot of building, a lot of funds. We just used what was already there, what was already funded, and we said, let's make it better through the right training, the right teachers, and the right approach, because they're so much dedicated to 21st century education. They do loads of training on technology, they do lots of training, and they are funded. They are one of the countries that has the biggest amount of support and funds for education. So just about gearing it to something specific, which we really felt that PBL, project-based learning, if integrated very early on, will make students and schools part of solutions, of finding solutions in their communities. So instead of just focusing on getting kids to memorize and write exams, it's like, how can they find solutions to projects and problems in their community through kind of the curriculum that is already available. So from one side, there's practical learning, there's authentic learning, there's purposeful learning, and also that eventually leads to a diversity of choices, not only kind of, I only have the Tawjihi academic track, and if I do, I'm gonna fail, I'm pushed to TVET. We're saying, no, it's like, all of that are wonderful tracks, but it depends on your passion and what you wanna do, and also what the labor market asks for, basically, and making sure that you're ready for it.
It was wonderful, Fatma, thank you very much. Are there any additional questions in the Q&A that you want to address? You want to make any closing comments in the last 2 minutes?
There are a few questions, but we can address them on the chat.
Directly on the chat.
Yeah, we can address them directly on the chat. In terms of closing comments, just thank you so much for the opportunity. We're so happy to share our work with you, to get this amazing feedback from everyone. And thank you so much to those engaging with us with questions. It's truly such an honor to be here. So thank you.
Well, thank you for a wonderful presentation, a great paper, which I know is going to get even better after you incorporate this feedback as you turn these into a chapter for a book. A number of you in the Q&A have been asking, can you get the slides? And there are two ways you'll be able to get this information. One is you should read the book, which will be available in March of this year, presenting all these papers. But we're also recording these on YouTube Live, and we'll be presenting, on Facebook Live, and we'll be uploading it on YouTube Live. So if you just look for those links, you'll be able to watch these presentations at your leisure and pause on any slide that you want to look more carefully. So at this point, let me invite the next team who's going to present an analysis of the education challenges of an education district in the United States, a district with a high proportion of English language learners. And this is Central Falls in Rhode Island. And we are delighted that the discussant for this paper is Dr. Sergio Paez, who's also a graduate of the Graduate School of Education, a very experienced and outstanding education leader, and who's the Director of Equity, Empowerment, and Excellence for Multilingual Learners in Central Falls School District. So we're ready for you. Over to you, Erica and Carson.
Thank you so much, Professor. Hello and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me and this incredible cohort of educational leaders and visionaries. Today, team members and I will be presenting our semester-long work, Shaping the Futures of Education for Multilingual Learners in Central Falls, where we assess the education reforms for the multilingual learners of Central Falls School District alongside UNESCO's Reimagining Our Futures Together report and offer policy recommendations for further improvement of their interventions. Next slide, please. My name is Erica Jose, and presenting with me today, we also have Carson Quillinan and Deanna Varanga. Next slide, please. Okay, to begin, some context on the school district we were so fortunate to work with. Central Falls School District sits in Central Falls, Rhode Island in the United States. Its town motto is diversity that inspires, which is reflected in the makeup of its school district, home to nearly 2,900 students, 82% of whom speak at least one other language besides English. Of the total students enrolled in CFSD, 48% are multilingual learners, a population of students that were the primary focus of our research. And while CFSD boasts a diverse student body, its schools are rated most poorly among all other state districts. And many statistics paint an adverse picture of what is impeding these students' success, such as a household median income that is less than half of the state's average, and roughly 2 in 3 children in Central Falls receiving food assistance in 2020. Additionally, ample evidence reveals a system that struggles to support its multilingual learners. CFSD data shows that less than 5% of multilingual learners in its district met expectations, which has a long-term impact on students' graduation rates. These percentages of achievement are historic and require careful and urgent attention. Based on our collection of data, we found that English proficiency is the widest barrier to academic success in CFSD. And while the metrics that gauge success remain the national standard for student achievement in the United States, there remains a fundamental need for stronger, more holistic programs and initiatives that amplify the assets of multilingual learners and improve their opportunities to succeed. And this is what our work explored. Next slide, please. So before we could explore ways to propel multilingual learners' achievement, we had to understand the specific barriers that contribute to the glaring statistics I mentioned before. In addition to the breadth of research on CFSD, we were also privileged to connect with teachers and school leaders to give deeper insight that would uncover what these root causes are. While our sample sizes were small and contexts are always highly complex, the information we gathered aligned with our research, and we came to assess 3 main root causes to focus on for our analysis. 1, a relevant and sustainable curriculum model to improve the language development of multilingual learners across the district, the involvement of and support for CFSD caregivers, and lastly, the capacity of CFSD teachers to support multilingual students. With these bottom line root causes, we were able to more keenly analyze where they fit into Central Falls' current district and state reforms, which Carson is going to tell you more about. Next slide, please.
In response to the bottom line that Erica just laid out, there are 2 reforms we'll be speaking about: the Rhode Island Blueprint for Multilingual Learners' Success and Central Falls School District Guiding Principles. Beginning with the Rhode Island Blueprint for Multilingual Learners' Success. This reform was created by the Rhode Island Department of Education with the ultimate goal of providing all Rhode Island multilingual learners with high quality education, which honors their cultural and linguistic assets, so they may be successful socially, politically, and economically, whether that be in Rhode Island or around the world. Overall, the theory of action is to create a system that allows for multilingual learners to thrive in various aspects of their life. The Rhode Island Department of Education plans to implement this reform over 5 years between 2021 to 2026. Next slide, please. Now, similarly on the district level, we have this reform, Central Falls Multilingual Learner Program Recommendations, otherwise known as the Guiding Principles. This was created by Dr. Paez, Central Falls School District Equity Director, in order to respond to the needs of multilingual learners in his school district specifically to uphold multilingual learners' rights to quality education by redefining what equity means within Central Falls School District. This theory of action examines how a more equitable system could be created and delivered for multilingual learners so they could prosper both in quantifiable ways, such as graduation rates and test scores, and in quality of life, such as with a sense of inclusion. It is evident in this theory of action that the guiding principles prioritize ESL teacher professionalization, evidence-based ESL curriculum instruction development, and the re-envisioning of how multilingual learners are integrated into the school culture, all of which align with the priorities in the UNESCO report. Next slide, please. What is exciting about these reforms is that while they're not born from the UNESCO report, there is alignment between them, which we found by determining areas of similar priorities between it and the blueprint and guiding principles. These areas of alignment include curricula and involving knowledge commons, pedagogies of cooperation and solidarity, transformative work of teachers, safeguarding and transforming schools, and education across time and spaces. We do find it promising that there is evidence of alignment, which is rooted in the need to re-envision education through these reforms in a holistic sense, whether it be explicitly in the schools, such as curriculum and pedagogy and teachers, or in a broader sense, in imagining education outside the four walls of the classroom. There are also opportunities for further alignment with the UNESCO report, which we believe could be natural and iterative for these new and developing reforms. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Carson. So this next section discusses opportunities for CFSD from this UNESCO perspective. As Carson mentioned, Central Falls is in its early phases of reform implementation, and we certainly took this reform rollout timeline and highly complex context when considering recommendations that would achieve two goals. One, to be complementary to CFSD's vision, research on best ESL education practice, and furthering alignment with the UNESCO report. And two, to consider concrete criteria such as feasibility, cost, efficacy, and impact. At their core, these recommendations present comprehensive pathways that highlight the urgency of addressing all vectors impacting multilingual learner success. The recommendations you see here are built off of the three original root causes mentioned earlier in this presentation, then outlines their expected outcomes. The themes of these recommendations are also aligned with their UNESCO report, endorsing strategic alignment of best practice in both curriculum and teacher development, which includes leveraging educator expertise and preparing teachers beyond ESL certification, more inclusion and collaboration between caregivers and educators to build capabilities, connections, cognition, and confidence between key stakeholders in multilingual learners' lives, and establishing school as a community hub that is universally committed to providing relevant and sustainable educational experiences for multilingual learners to ensure an environment of belonging and inclusion. Next slide, please. So this leads us to our final theory of action, which we use as a way to communicate the most feasible first steps in achieving transformational change for CFSD's multilingual learners. It involves a three-pronged collaborative effort that implements a bounded autonomy framework for relevant and sustainable multilingual learner curriculum development, a teacher-caregiver design team, and a cooperative continuum of professional development for CFSD educators. We hope this prevents CFSD students, caregivers, teachers, and school leaders with a framework that posits a vision that supports a transformational reimagining of the futures of multilingual learners' whole student success together. Next slide, please. Thank you so much for joining us today in reimagining the futures of education around the world. At this time, we will look forward to hearing from Dr. Sergio Paez of Central Falls and a Q&A.
Sergio, over to you.
All right, thank you so much. Appreciate it. After all this work, I mean, you've been working extremely hard to get all this data, all these numbers crunched into a great analysis of what is happening in an urban district in the United States. So I always puzzled by the concept of learning language, English, in an urban setting in a country of immigrants. We are a country of immigrants and we really haven't figured out yet how to do it effectively. What we see in Central Falls is a historic failure of language development, and we have this great momentum going on with the blueprint of multilingual success from the state. We have now the UNESCO report that on the right time came in to give us a new set of values and perspectives, and hopefully the energy that we need to make changes. But I think my message more than anything is how can we generate changes in districts like Central Falls, like urban settings in America. We have this new population, new immigrants. That's the future of our country in front of us. And this particular group of kids come from Guatemala. 72% of them come from Guatemala. They're Central Americans, many of them unaccompanied minors. Social emotional issues are at the center of their experience. And we are trying to just in the middle of the pandemic, imagine having all these odds against you, and then you have no computers or no way to understand how to use computers. So for the first time, being able to be integrated in a community that doesn't exist because it's virtual. So all these components make it so hard for these few new generation of immigrants coming into our country. But I think what is clear, and I'm fascinated by the report because it's really highlighting something that very few people do, which is what happened when kids don't learn. We really don't know how to react when the students don't learn. And we have the same kids, historically Black and brown. I mean, we have the historical failure of public schools in the United States with specific groups of kids. So what this perspective is giving us is how can we develop something that is unique for this community with all this kind of mix of things happening. The blueprint of multilingual success is a call of action. Everybody talks about equity, which is almost tiring. Everybody's in the name of justice trying to change something, and things remain the same. So how can we generate something? I think the value of the paper is how you were looking into very specific voices, teachers, administrators, the data, which is very powerful. We're talking about data, which is the academic failure for perhaps one generation, maybe two generations. How can we do something different? And I think the reflection for the UNESCO perspective is how can not only United States, which is an example of success in many ways, having been able to figure it out. It's very humbling that we still can find the right combination of things to do it. And I think the role of us in this role, future leaders or leaders in education, or for some of my role as a leader for many, many years, is how can we do something different, something that is inspirational, something that is going to be transformational. But it has to be a bold decision. It has to be something that is really changing the curriculum, the methodology, what the research is telling us. We sometimes are more comfortable doing more of the same, but we just need to look at what the truth is on research. In this particular case, what is the language development model we need to use for these multilingual learners? Everybody's doing English only. And I'm so surprised because Massachusetts, I was in Massachusetts for about 22 years, and now in the last 4 years here, we've been doing curriculum for multilingual learners. We've been doing bilingual education for many, many years. In here, we're debating if English only is better than multilingual education. In the UNESCO report, it says respecting language and culture, super important for our kids, for our communities. How can we do that using the right research? So one of the cornerstones of my principles is how to provide direct ESL instruction. It has to be specifically taught. You can be in 7th grade or in 10th grade and still need to learn the ABCs because you just came in from another country last week. You still have to develop the language component. So that is specific teaching model, curriculum that is relevant, that is engaging, that is respectful of our kids is super, super important for that. So the last thing I'm going to say is thank you for all your work on this great paper. I enjoyed reading it, and I hope that many people will look at it and say, okay, let's reflect on this. What is this going to tell us about what I need to do in my own setting? Because it's great when we succeed, and we all have tremendous champions when everybody's succeeding, everybody's taking credit for the success. But when failure happens, there's very few people saying, I caused that. And I've been in urban education asking that question, who's causing this failure? And we are the intellectual individuals who are making the decisions to maintain the status quo. We need to interrupt the status quo. And I hope that this paper and this conversation is going to be making the motivation necessary to be able to see things from a different perspective, from the perspective of what education is telling us. What is the wisdom of research? And then do what works and stop doing what doesn't work. So with that, I close my comments. Thank you for your work on this, and I appreciate it. I hope that many, many people will read it, and then we will get some examples of success across the country and around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sergio, for working with this team, first of all, during the semester, for reading their work, and for your very helpful feedback. So at this point, I'd like to invite the authors of the paper to take a look at some of the questions that are in the Q&A and then address some of them.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Paez, for being with us today and for your generous feedback, as always, accompanying us on this journey. I would like to start with one question by Mr. Sohair, where he highlights that the World Bank mentions that the main problem with poor achievement among MLLs are actually the fact that they speak a different language at home, different from that being taught in schools. And this is why when we were looking at root causes, one that came up through our primary research by engaging directly with teachers was this need to have caregivers actually involved in the process. So they are a critical part of the success of students, and we need to acknowledge that. And it's part of our final recommendation to have their voices at the fore and to actually address the fact, the challenges around literacy, parent literacy and engagement. So that is something we kept in mind. I would also like to maybe redirect this question to Erica so she can maybe speak more to the language piece that we can see in schools in Central Falls to address specifically this bilingual challenge.
Thank you so much, Deanna, and thank you, Dr. Paez. I actually find a really great connection between this question and Zara, who asked a question about teacher and caregiver collaboration as a form of community engagement to really kind of bring this as we kind of explore the importance of informal learning and the importance of bringing this cultural heritage into the formal learning settings, given that a lot of the standards are around this English standardization. And what we looked at was actually this dual capacity building framework for school and family partnerships that was developed here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education that follows a really distinct timeline that brings teachers and caregivers together to really establish a sense and culture of trust, building capabilities, and connections, and really skill building together. And we've seen this actually play out in a couple of other districts in the Northeast of the United States, where families and teachers get together on either weekly or monthly basis to really strategize, where caregiver, and as Dr. Paez spoke to, this is really essential, especially for children who were unaccompanied in coming to the United States. And so just establishing sort of this sense of wraparound care that is consistent, where voices of caregivers are brought to the table consistently, and then taken into more formal and policymaking considerations, such as school board conversations. And Dr. Paez, please feel free to step in at any time if you feel that
Thank you. No, I know we discussed this in length, and this is what happened. I think the answer goes to who's responsible, right? Who's responsible for the education of our kids? And I say it's 5 perspectives. It's the students, the community, the teachers, the leadership, the community in general. When we talk about parents, it's very easy to give them the responsibility to educate our kids. But what we need to say is how I'm helping the families to be able to help the kids. Because if you said, oh, I'm educated, therefore my kids would be educated. But when you have a group of people that came in from another country, they don't speak the language, which goes to the heart of what this question is. How are we helping that family to empower them about what are the support systems in place to be able to help this family to navigate the very complex system of education opportunities in the United States? Do I place my child in advanced placement, or when honor classes, or in the rehabilitation classes all the time? What do I need to do, even though I don't speak the language? The parents could help us in the native language as much as possible, because all those concepts transfer. So I think empowering our families to then support us and become partners of the educational philosophy and how to be helping our kids is such an important component. So every time we ask, okay, the families need to be more involved, the question needs to be, what am I doing to empower our families to collaborate and partner with the school district? It's not just, okay, it's up to them, I'm teaching, they need to be learning because of that. No. We have to empower, create the structures that Erica is talking about. If we have a philosophy How is that theory of action translate? Are you having nightly meetings, weekly meetings? Are you teaching them ESL? Are you teaching them the content and how to support reading at home? What is it that we're doing with our families? So I think that connection is, yes, that's a problem, and how we address that problem, empowering our families, is a key factor. So thank you.
Are there other questions on the chat you would like to address? On the Q&A, I'm sorry.
There are a couple questions here. I'm seeing some threads along the chat, specifically about different types of ESL education and what does immersion, strictly immersion, look like in an English-only environment. And to be clear, in the United States, there are three main ways that multilingual learners are educated. And the amazing thing about Central Falls, and what Dr. Paez has spoken to consistently in the presentation, is how really diverse our multilingual population is. It's not just a single language besides English that students are coming to the table with. And child development studies and our understanding of cognitive neuroscience shows that when people speak multiple languages, it ensues for a thriving brain. And so kind of taking away the opportunity to really build on that skill for children, we really feel, or not feel, but the science reveals, is depriving them of an incredible opportunity for optimal development. And so what Central Falls really faces is designing multilingual strategies that are specific to each school, because even within its small district population, each school is very, very unique. And so just deciding on one single approach to ESL education would be kind of denying that the richness and diversity. And so I hope that brings some answers, some clarifications to a few. And if my teammates want to add anything in there, that would be, love to hear.
I did want to add a little bit to that, Erica, that you so beautifully explained. And then looking a little bit at Liza's question about pedagogies for engaging multilingual learners, some wonderful things that we saw happening at Central Falls as far as pedagogy going, one of them being the Newcomer Academy, which you can read more about in the book. A little plug for you there, Professor Reimers, too, and for the rest of us. There's this really wonderful Newcomer Academy for people and students who come in who are brand new to Central Falls and brand new to the country, who might not know. And this idea of having direct ESL service. But this wonderful part of the guiding principles and also the blueprint is this uplifting of direct ESL service. So not just this licensure, not just this check in the box of teachers get licensed, teachers can answer a question on a test and get a scrap of paper, but actual quality pedagogy to incorporate ESL pedagogies that can uplift students who are multilingual learners. And Dr. Paez, I would love if you have further comments on this, because this is such a wonderful part of what we saw at Central Falls School District and the direction that you guys are going in.
Thank you so much. So yeah, I think the central theme is, how can we make content comprehensible? Whatever you do, make sure it's comprehensible. When we are teaching to someone and that person doesn't understand what we're saying, that's where the violation of civil rights are. Cuando yo estoy hablando algo y no me entienden, ahí es cuando pasa el problema. Cuando yo digo algo y ustedes no me entienden lo que estoy diciendo, ahí es donde está la violación de los derechos civiles. If I just said something and you didn't understand what I was saying, I wasn't really making myself comprehensible, or I wasn't making the message comprehensible. Imagine how happy people are in general, but the kids are learning 1, 2, 3, 5 sentences in a week or 2 weeks. But how many gaps we created for that learning? We have to make sure that content, the algebra, the biology, the science, the social studies, everything is being communicated. That's what the value of bilingual education is. You can be saying, oh, they have to learn English. I got it, yes, but they have to learn content. It's maybe more important. I always use my MIT example. 65% of the kids at MIT are not from the United States, and they don't speak English as the first language, but they are in one of the premier universities in the world. So content doesn't have a language. What we need to make sure is that when we teach content, which is what the kids need to learn, is that we do it in a comprehensible way. If you use direct ESL instruction, multisensory environments, is how we respect that civil right to have meaningful academic opportunities in our settings. So that's fundamental. So thank you for the prompts on how we do things in Central Falls. We are trying to make it work. We open a dual language school pre-K through 6, dual language, 50% Spanish, 50% English. It's a beautiful school. No gaps are created at any point because we do in both languages progressively, and we open middle school and high school. Ideally, like the rest of the world is showing us, we have to be a multilingual nation. So we need to be able to develop more of those environments to help our kids and help our communities and help our world to be a better place. Thank you.
Well, as we conclude, there is a question on the chat that invites the students to reflect on what were the greatest takeaways for you of doing this work. So maybe we can take the last few minutes of this panel to invite the panelists on that reflection.
I'm happy to share a little bit of this experience. The most valuable part of this course was absolutely the hands-on work that we got to do with Dr. Paez. It's one thing to learn theory in books, and we're so many educators on this call, so I'm preaching to the choir, but it's something completely different to be on the ground. The most valuable piece, I think, was also hearing from teachers directly. And that, I would say, is an area of opportunity for our team and for the rest of the teams to really engage and co-construct solutions with communities on the ground. I believe that is something we hoped to do more of, and yet this is why courses such as the one we did with Professor Reimers have so much potential, because we're not just building here politicians, but we're building people who are genuinely passionate about policy and seeing how can we leverage policy to affect change. So that was my piece. Beyond, I don't think I've experienced something similar to this at Harvard to date. And I want to really commend Professor Reimers on everything he does with the students in this course. Erica Carson, would you like to add anything to that?
I absolutely have enjoyed working with Dr. Paez and learning so much here. As somebody who has a background in special education, which is rooted in equity, it has been a pleasure to work in an equitable space again, but learning the nuances in a different realm, particularly with multilingual learners. And I think it just continues to show that equity does not exist whenever communities are not involved. The communities that are served that are not involved. You can be the smartest person in any room and know the theory, but have absolutely no impact because you cannot co-construct or you did not consider others in that construction. So I think that that was a beautiful part of this, was working with the people that would be impacted if these recommendations were to be taken further. And then the wonderful voice that Dr. Paez brought and some of the wonderful vulnerability that he brought to us too, over the struggles that he has shown us, or in the insight that he's had with his students. Truly working with somebody passionate in that realm it's perspective changing and it is impactful. So thank you so much for this opportunity to everybody here.
Well, thank you so much. I think on that note, we're going to transition to the next presentation. Thank you to this team, and thank you so much, Sergio, for your careful reading of that paper. We're now going to transition. I invite the members of this team to take a look at some of the questions that remain in the Q&A and answer them online. So now we're going to hear about another program serving disadvantaged students, this time in Israel, the MBR Edgar program. And we're going to hear from this team presenting the paper, and then we're going to hear from Dr. Isaac Frumin, a wonderful colleague, director of the Higher School of Economics, of the Institute of Education of the Higher School of Economics. Thank you so much, Isaac, for your careful reading of this paper and for being with us today. So without further ado, over to you, Tom and Abigail.
Good morning or evening for those who've joined us from distant locations. My name is Abigail Reed, and it is an honor to present our group's research today, along with my colleague, Tom Naftagal. Next slide, please. My colleagues, Tom, Lindsay Pockel, Shambhavi Singh, and I had the privilege to work with the Israeli Ministry of Education on this project. Today, we examine the Mabar Edgar program administered by the Division of the Israeli Ministry of Education that is focused on supporting youth characterized as at risk. We start by describing vulnerable youth in Israel. We then explain the Mabar Edgar program, including its theory of action, key components of implementation, and results. We then use the UNESCO report as a framework to identify ways to enhance the program's impact. We find 2 areas in which the program already aligns with the spirit of the report, especially in its teacher professionalization and focus on schools as safeguarding spaces. We find areas of misalignment with the report in the program's intense focus on the countrywide high-stakes matriculation certificate and in the skills gap between highly trained Mabar Edgar teachers and other core subject teachers. Accordingly, we conclude our analysis by making 2 recommendations to the ministry. We elaborate on these later in the presentation. Next slide, please. For our research, we conducted in-depth interviews with key ministry officials, teachers, and instructional coaches from October to December 2021. We also analyzed official documents, including governmental directives, professional development guides, and program tools. Next slide, please.
Now we turn to talk about the Mabar Edgar program. Of the more than 2 million children living in Israel, approximately 330,000, roughly 16%, live in adverse conditions. The government defines vulnerable youth as minors between the ages of 12 and 18 who are exposed to 1 or more risk factors. To support their needs, a designated division for youth at risk under the Ministry of Education administers several different educational responses. One of these programs was established in the mid-90s, Mabar Edgar, which is an in-school program meant to support these youth to successfully integrate in public high schools and complete the high-stakes nationally administered matriculation certificate, which is required for higher education and employment opportunities in Israel. The government identifies 9th graders who accumulated significant learning gaps and who are likely to drop out or fail to complete the matriculation certificate. These students are then enrolled in designated classrooms for Mabar Edgar students throughout grades 10 to 12 in public schools. In 2021, 32,000 students participated in this program nationwide. The goals of this program are twofold: to decrease dropout rates in high schools and increase student learning outcomes as reflected in eligibility for the matriculation certificate. Next slide, please. The program's theory of action rests on several key ingredients: funding smaller class sizes, increasing teacher-student instruction hours, developing student self-efficacy and motivation to learning, and implementing individualized education plans. We conceptualize its implementation scheme using 3 perspectives. From a psychological perspective, this program utilizes a pedagogical approach developed by the ministry called therapeutic pedagogy, meant to shift vulnerable youth mindset about learning and their abilities to thrive in academic settings. Teachers use empowering teaching methods addressing low self-efficacy and learning difficulties. They also support students in setting short-term goals and that make academic success visible to them and their families. Because teachers are key to a successful implementation, Mabar Edgar provides specialized teacher training to develop their knowledge and tools to work with vulnerable youth, fostering an asset-based perception of their background and skills to build stronger teacher-student relationships. From an institutional perspective, the program is supported by strong collaboration between designated Mabar Edgar officials at the school and district level with the ministerial division. Studies conducted by national organizations found strong evidence speaking to the program's success in meeting its goals. Still, an 11% of matriculation eligibility persists between Mabar Edgar students and the wider population, which sparked our interest to analyze how the program can be enhanced. Next slide, please. We chose the UNESCO report as a futuristic framework for advancing education systems. We find 2 main points of alignment between the report and the program: strengthening teacher professionalization and commitment to safeguarding schools. To advance teacher professionalization, Mabar Edgar nationally administered and supervised teacher training and professional development actively creates spaces for networking and building communities of practice within and outside districts. Professional opportunities are adjusted to teachers' needs through ongoing teacher surveys and data collection by districts and the ministry. Also, teachers are empowered to share innovations and best practices in these sessions. Specialized trainings are also effective in enabling teachers to adjust to challenging circumstances like those introduced during the pandemic, preparing them to work autonomously with students and families and accommodate needed flexibility. We also found evidence of commitment to ensuring schools are safeguarding spaces for transformation through utilizing two strategies. The first is collecting data on each student's social and emotional, protective, and risk factors through a dynamic holistic mapping tool. This data collection instrument allows teachers and school administrators to individualize interventions to ensure students' needs are met and to rally national stakeholders around data to inform policymaking. This tool is filled out 4 times a year by teachers and addresses students' academic behavior, mental health, learning disabilities diagnosis, social emotional skills like persistent and self-regulation, home factors, as well as strengths and hobbies. The second strategy is to build strong homeschool connections. Teachers mentor students while visiting their homes at least once a year. Teachers receive training on how to enter homes, facilitate meetings, and help parents see their child through an asset-based perspective. Teachers create contracts with students and their families, outlining learning goals to establish continuous homeschool dialogue, which then increases parental engagement in response to teachers' commitment. Next slide, please.
Despite considerable alignment with the report, we identified 2 opportunities to strengthen the program's success. To create policy recommendations for each area of opportunity, we used academic research and the UNESCO report to generate 3 alternatives, evaluated each alternative against 4 criteria: effectiveness, cost, administrative feasibility, and practicality, analyzed trade-offs, and selected a final recommendation. The first area of opportunity stems from Mabar Edgar's intense focus on the high-stakes matriculation certificate, seen countrywide as a key step in helping students secure future success. While the program develops students' motivation and confidence to achieve matriculation eligibility, it does not emphasize why matriculation course content matters in students' lives and goals beyond completing the exam. Research affirms the critical importance of fostering future orientation and intrinsic motivation, particularly for learners from low socioeconomic backgrounds, a concept also highlighted in the UNESCO report. Accordingly, we see opportunities for Mabar Edgar to help students envision how their current learning connects to their future aspirations. We recommend that Mabar Edgar infuse future orientation discussions in their existing teacher-student mentoring mechanism. These guided discussions would leverage Mabar Edgar teachers' existing mentoring practice of setting short-term goals during home visits by helping students articulate long-term goals, for example, how they envision their military service and employment prospects, thus encouraging reflection on how matriculation course content connects to future goals. The second area of opportunity we identified arises from misalignment with the UNESCO report's emphasis on teacher collaboration while ensuring that schools serve as platforms for cooperation, care, and change. We discovered that only homeroom teachers of Mabar Edgar cohorts are required to complete specialized training sessions for working with vulnerable youth. However, these students are also taught by other teachers in school. In fact, most classes are taught by professional subject matter teachers. Though these professional teachers can access specialized Mabar Edgar trainings, they're not required to do so, and in many cases are not equipped to sufficiently understand these students' unique backgrounds. It is essential that the program close the divide between homeroom and professional teachers to ensure Mabar Edgar students receive consistent and specialized support from all adults at school. Currently, there is limited data on the gaps these professional teachers have in terms of best practices for working with vulnerable youth, as well as limited data on their disincentives to participate in Mabar Edgar trainings. Therefore, we recommend that Mabar Edgar conduct a gap analysis through surveying teachers about present gaps between homeroom and professional teachers' capacity to support Mabar Edgar students. This survey would not only surface educators' needs on the ground and utilize existing knowledge, but also strengthen interinstitutional collaboration to inform national policymaking. Ultimately, we believe the Mabar Edgar program offers powerful insights into how educational policies can mitigate social inequities through commitment to education as a public and common good. We would like to conclude by once again thanking Mabar Edgar officials and teachers for their support throughout our research. Thank you. We look forward to your questions and feedback.
Thank you very much. We are now going to hear from Isaac Frumin, who's going to provide feedback to this paper.
Dear Fernanda, dear colleagues, it's a great pleasure and honor for me to comment this paper. Let me take a few minutes from my scarce time resource to tell you the personal story. When I was 29, it was very strange situation. I was appointed as a school principal in one big city in Russia. And this school was located in what we call bad neighborhood. And when
Isaac, you went on mute. Can you please unmute yourself?
I'm unmute.
Excellent, excellent. You're fine now.
Yeah. So again, as a new.
So I don't know what's going on, but you've been muted again, Isaac.
Oh, what's going on?
Now it's good. Now we hear you. Go ahead. No, we cannot hear you now. So something is not working well. Try again, Isaac. Sorry about that. Do you have? Do you have a different microphone maybe that you can use? Not the one in the headphones, but the computer one. Go ahead.
Do you hear me now?
We can hear you now better. Yes, Isaac. And now we don't hear you again. So for some reason, the internet doesn't want to hear us, doesn't want us to hear your story about the time.
Okay, maybe.
No. Nope, not working, Isaac. Go ahead.
Do you hear me?
Yes. So it turns out we hear you for the first few seconds and then the line drops.
Let me, so why don't we go to questions and answers and I connect from a different device?
Okay, I think that's excellent. We will do that. Thank you so much. You know, we have to put things in perspective that it's amazing that the technology we have allow us to be communicating with discussants from Russia, discussants from Colombia, literally all over the world. And then we have a wonderful group of attendees. So I'm going to invite the panelists to take a look at some of the questions in the Q&A. And so take a look at some of those and then address them while Isaac comes back.
Wonderful. Thank you, Professor. Our first question is from Andy. Their question is, are there any considerations made for students where Hebrew is not their first language, or for students who are immigrants from the diaspora returning to Israel who are still in the process of acquiring Hebrew, Russian, Arabic, or English? The answer is that the Mubarak program is found within the public schools throughout Israel, which means it could be in Hebrew or Arabic public schools, speaking public schools. I don't know if my colleagues want to answer more or add to that.
Just to add to Lindsay's comment, the curriculum's fairly centralized and the medium of instruction is Hebrew or Arabic. Definitely, it would be a good idea to have a multilingual frame where the lesson frame is being given in the institutional language, which could be Hebrew or Arabic, and the supportive frame where the teachers have this dialogue where they try and clarify and try and understand if they understood the concepts, should be native. There's enough evidence that supports this. Perhaps there's area to be explored. There's research that could be done to look at this. And anyone else wants to answer this?
I see that Isaac is with us. So maybe, Isaac, are you still with us now? He was here a moment ago.
Yes.
Okay, let's hear from you. Go ahead, Isaac.
Okay, let's try again. To make the long story short, as I told you, I became a principal of schools in difficult urban district. And I was very optimistic because I was young and inexperienced. And I brought a couple of my friends from university there. And I was told that all bad students from surrounding schools came to this new school. So we decided to have a big event in the end of school year to show that the school is different. We invited a band. We found money to serve students with soft drinks, etc., etc. So next day, when I came to the school, I found that all windows on the second floor of the school were broken. So I was devastated, and I asked my deputy what's going on, and she said that, oh, you know, that's a bad neighborhood, and they have such a tradition for every year after the end of the school. They just it's kind of celebration. They break windows, glasses. And I realized that how difficult it is to change the culture and to deal with these kids who, and that is very important, they don't just have low level of academic preparedness. Let's imagine these kids came to the first grade probably with some relatively high expectations. And in 9 years, they lost the hope, they lost positive vision of school and their future. So this is why I will not tell you now how I managed this problem in my school. It looks, I think that I had some good experience, not just bad experience. But this is why I was very interested in this report, and I have to congratulate the team. What I found the most interesting in your work, not in the program in Israel, but in your work, I found that you really tried to use knowledge-based approach to educational policy and educational changes. You really thoughtfully used a number of very interesting research papers, UNESCO report. It's very clever use of when you see what is aligned, what's not aligned. And I like how you came with alternatives. And I have to tell you that the alternatives that you suggested are not trivial. And that's extremely important because your whole idea about that we need to go beyond matriculation exams, that we need to change the vision of the future of these kids is extremely powerful. In fact, I have to tell you that there is one important scholar whom you didn't quote, but who would be really useful here. Famous Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky, because Vygotsky said that the key to the success in the development in adolescence is the interests of a person. And the key to the interests of a person is his or her vision of their adulthood. But here we have a but. Again, let's think that these kids had very bad experience in schools. That's a correct assumption, I think. So does this program do anything really to open up this experience, to talk about this experience, to treat it somehow? I think not, because these kids, first, they are selected. And that's a question that you didn't touch. I think it's extremely important, the negative selection. It's, in fact, in my school, I did try this and failed. When I selected a group of low achieving students, put them in separate class, and it was extremely difficult because it was a stigma on them. But what's more important, again, and Fernando forgives me, I think it's also a problem a bit with UNESCO report, that it's very school-centered. Again, the problem of these kids, how they can think about their future if they didn't see another life, if they didn't see other adults. So maybe we can bring best teachers to them, but their futures in most cases is not teaching. So I guess that the big problem that your analysis didn't really touch upon is that, again, and you are completely correct that we have to work with their vision of their adulthood, but we have to think how to bring this vision, how to grow this. And I'm sure that schools' walls are too high to do that. That's the first point. And again, here we have, and so the very strong emphasis on teachers, in my opinion, is also very limited. We have to think not just about teachers, but about adults whom they kids can meet. In fact, it also reminds me a relatively recent book of Robert Putnam, Our Kids, where he mentions the importance of this exposure of kids to wider social world. And if you read Robert Putnam's book with sufficient attention, you would see where the biggest difference in the experience of these kids and kids from well-off families. It's extracurriculum education. And Israeli program and your analysis, unfortunately, do not touch that. And why extracurriculum is extremely important? Because extracurricular activities is the area where students can exercise their agency and interest. Is the area where they can try new things and be successful. This is why sports, arts, etc., not just project-based learning as you recommended, could be extremely important in changing the vision of the students regarding their learning experience. So again, I have to congratulate you because the analysis of alternatives, even cost efficiency analysis, as a former World Bank person, I really like that you looked at efficiency issues as well. So it's done beautifully. But let's, in the future, think if we deal with the problem of the kids who have very limited future perspectives, can really only school and teacher change it? I think that if we want to have real change, we have to answer this question honestly. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and sorry for internet connection here.
Isaac, that was phenomenal. And thank you for the close reading and for your suggestions, which I'm sure this team is going to use in actually turning this paper into a chapter for publication. If we have some time at the end, I'd love to know what happened with the windows and how you solve it. But let me turn it over to the team and ask if there are any comments that you want to make in response to the feedback from Isaac Frumin.
Yeah, thank you, Isaac. I thought your comments were very illuminating. And this is an area we would certainly look at what could be done beyond the classroom, because a lot of engagement of these students happens in environments that are outside school, and those engagements are not necessarily positive. So we'll certainly take this point and we'll look beyond other strategies such as project learning and perhaps focus more on the identity and how could they envision a better future than their parents had. So thank you for your comments and we really appreciate it.
There's a question in the Q&A, and if others of you have questions, please feel free to post them, where Elif Buber is agreeing with you, Isaac, on the importance of extracurricular activities. How much can the school, with its limited duration, really shape the life of a kid when everything else around the school is kind of pushing kids in a different direction? Any other comments from the team before we ask Isaac to tell us how the story of the broken windows was managed?
For me, I just wanted to thank you, Isaac, for reading our paper and for taking the time and for your comments. Thank you, Professor, for allowing us this opportunity and pushing us throughout the semester. And then also thank you to our team. We spent so many hours together and I just think the world of all of you.
That's great. So Isaac, can you tell us, how did you manage the problem of the broken windows? I kind of regret that you gave that example because our classrooms, you've been to Gottman Library, have lots of windows, and I hope nobody gets any ideas from that story. This is not an appropriate way to celebrate the end of the academic year or to express your happiness, but tell us how you solved the problem.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It didn't happen immediately. So next year we had maybe half of the windows broken, and the year after the next, we had no windows broken. And the reason is that we tried to build a sense of ownership within this group of students. We call them, you can call them with deviant behavior, etc., with two instruments. First, one of my colleagues was a mountain climber, and he organized a group of these students to go before the final graduation ceremony, to go to, if I remember correctly, 5 days trip to the mountains. And he invited a couple of adults, not from schools. One was engineer, another was a journalist, and they were with these kids. So the relationships between adults and these young, mostly boys, but there were girls as well, young people changed. And another, we also created for them a small brigade, a small team that participated in school repair works, and we paid to them. So and indirectly, it really changed their behavior. But again, my point is that we had to go outside of normal teaching process to do that. And I like the comment that many of these kids, they live in the environment where they don't see positive examples. And we have to change that. Without that, they can get, and your colleagues were right in your analysis, they can get better matriculation marks, grades, but are they going to be successful in their life? It's not obvious. Thank you, Fernando.
The other point you're underscoring, Isaac, is not just that one learns in many different contexts other than the school, is that the range of different domains of what one learns are integrated. And if we think of the challenge of supporting disadvantaged kids exclusively as the narrow challenge of help them develop academic skills, we may miss other important domains on which academic skills are embedded. And so when you talk about the example of your colleague who took them to the mountain, and when you talk about the experience of these kids and the imaginings that they have for themselves, self-image, perception, relations with others, you are talking about a multidimensional conception of what are the outcomes that matter. And one way to take that discussion is to say those dimensions are developed in many places. The other direction to take that is the school should not be too narrowly focused on academics, because for some kids, it may do them a disservice. So I guess you've underscored both points. Anyway, thank you all very much for a wonderful presentation, for a terrific discussion, Isaac. I so appreciate you could be with us. And at this point, let's turn it over to the next team. We are going to hear from a team of students, Yenga Azurzana, Julia Rose, Ling Tang, and Daniel Nismian, who are going to talk about Mongolia. And our discussant is Dr. Faryal Khan, a graduate of our school, a senior education from UNESCO, who's joining us from Bangkok. Faryal, I so appreciate that you must be up very late in the evening or very, very early in the dawn hours of the morning. So without further ado, let's turn it over to Julia and Ling.
Okay, I'm gonna start. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Uyanga from Mongolia, and with me today, my teammates, Julia Rhodes from the US, Ling Tang from Singapore, and our teammate, Daniel Nisiman from Israel, just had a healthy little baby last night, so he won't be here today for the good reason. We are honored and humbled to be at this conference to present our work. We would like to thank Professor Reimers and our client, the Mongolian Ministry of Education and Culture, and all the people who have supported us throughout this journey. Next slide, please. So today we're going to discuss these three main questions, which highlight how Mongolians' most current reform efforts align with the Futures Report, and present 4 policy alternative theories of action that we proposed in our paper, that we think help the Mongolian education system more towards greater alignment. Next slide, please. So these are the methods that we used to write our report. To gain an accurate understanding of Mongolian's education system and reform, we collaborated with the Mongolian Ministry of Education and Culture. Specifically, we worked with the Director of Policy Planning Department and used a combination of qualitative and quantitative methods to research and analyze the education reforms. To ensure a well-rounded and accurate perspective of the system, we interviewed representatives from each level of stakeholders, including students, teachers, parents, educational organizations, which are school principals, university staff, as well as government-affiliated agencies. Next slide, please. Mongolia's reform plan, Vision 2050, is a long-term development plan that was initiated into 2020. It consists of 3 phases, and our paper focused on the first phase, which is the midterm development plan for 2021 to 2030. We specifically looked at how the reform plans for general education are aligned with the ideas in the Futures Report. This plan emphasizes on the holistic development of Mongolian active citizens through quality, open, inclusive, and flexible education services that engage in lifelong learning and on improving the internal and external education quality assurance systems. Political and socioeconomic factors have impacted previous Mongolian education reforms and system progress. Frequent changes in the education laws and national curricula in the last decade, and to meet the long-term goals, Vision 2050 have led the new administration to propose new education bills, which is currently under discussion for approval. And these bills drafts were opened for public, and more than 24,000 people offered feedback and comments. Next slide, please. So Mongolia's reform objectives stated in government and development documents are much aligned with the Futures Report. Today, due to the time constraints, we're going to highlight only a few areas that are relevant to Mongolia's reform alignments within each of the 5 main topics of the Futures Report. The first one, pedagogies of cooperation and solidarity. One of the areas that is crucial for the long-term sustainable quality education is the ongoing assessment system. There's an immediate need to update and have relevant and coherent assessment standards for general education schools. Mongolia will be participating in PISA for the first time in 2022, which results will support national policies and evidence-based decision-making. The current policy discontinued the grading system in grades from 1 to 3, but it's inconsistent across schools. However, this demonstrates Mongolia's efforts to prioritize the formative assessments. The second, curricula. Reform documents broadly discuss curriculum content relating to strengthening ICT and inquiry learning skills, and the importance of studying the Mongolian history, heritage, and culture in order to develop national identity. Midterm goals also aim to align with the international standards. Now I'm going to pass to Julia to discuss the 30 alignments.
Teachers. Mongolia has made great efforts in the past in trying to increase the professionalization of the teaching profession. Even when met with pushback from the teaching workforce, there have been efforts made to accommodate teachers' requests. The current reform discusses many plans to elevate the teaching profession by promoting merit-based selection and appointment that is free from political influence and setting other ambitious objectives that include accreditation of pre-service programs, school-based mentored teacher activities for novice teachers, and university-based professional development training systems for school leaders and managers. Schools. In reform documents, it is stated that schools will be transformed to become human development centers, offering not only knowledge, education, and skills to children, but also help them grow up healthy with a growth mindset and live a patriotic life proud of their Mongolian heritage. Working with development partners, Mongolia has set plans and allotted funds towards structural, material, and human resources to increase the inclusivity of general education environments. Access to in-person school has been championed over the years, and Mongolia is working hard over the last decade to transition the education system into a digital system. And with the help of development partners and government agencies, Mongolia's digital infrastructure is thriving. However, professional development at the school, local, and state levels regarding the use of digital technologies and assessment is needed. Society. Mongolia's reform plans and legislation emphasize the importance of providing educational opportunities over the entire lifespan in different cultural and social spaces. To promote lifelong learning, Mongolia hopes to transition rural distant learning centers into virtual learning sites to support learners, providing resources and opportunities for both children and adults. Other themes consistently expressed across documents and interviews are principles of openness, transparency, good governance, and evidence-based decision-making. However, these principles rest on the interrelationship of government, local, professional, and public organizations. The reform documents discussed a solid quality assurance system in combination with an EMIS will support the development of these principles. Overall, Mongolian strengths are within its resilient nature, growth mindset mentality at the state level, and international partnership. Weaknesses are within financial resources, consistency in policy implementation, domestic collaboration, and teachers' capacity. The policy alternatives proposed aim to offer ways in which to strengthen the system's implementation capacity and how to motivate a shared growth mindset across all levels of stakeholders. Passing it over to Ling.
And now I will present 4 policy alternatives together with that series of action. Can we have the next slide, please? Yes, that's right. Policy alternative 1, a culture of quality data. If there is a shared belief to practice data collection and management, as well as using this data to support decision-making across all education sectors, then Mongolia will be able to use this data-driven ICT infrastructure to make high-quality evidence-based decisions and ensure public accountability. Policy alternative number 2, teacher recruitment. If all public schools run high school teacher apprenticeship programs to expose students to early teaching experiences, students will be able to affirm their interest in teaching before enrolling in pre-service teacher colleges. This will help to create a bigger group of teacher candidates with the right disposition before they enroll in the teacher colleges, leading to higher quality teachers over time. Policy Alternative 3, developing a school leadership pipeline. Mongolia can improve its school leadership pipeline process through identifying and assessing leadership potential in teachers early in their careers, followed by providing mandatory training to all principals, which will help them to manage the complexities and diversities of a 21st century school. The highlight of this mandatory principal training will be the mentorship segment, where the newly appointed principals will receive support and learning opportunities with experienced principals. This policy alternative will increase the consistency and accountability in policy implementation at the school level, leading to improved educational outcomes. Last but not least, policy alternative 4, creation of a specialized implementation unit. In the past, Mongolia has faced difficulties in implementing education policies. We advise to develop a highly skilled independent team with the specific responsibility to help align system resources, build and monitor capacity, develop partnership across stakeholders. Even during political changes in Mongolia, this unit should remain and continue to carry out its responsibilities. This will be one of the biggest strengths of this implementation unit. We have chosen to place this policy alternative in the most outer ring in this diagram, as we believe that this alternative helps to ensure and monitor the effective implementation of policies and the consistency of quality standards in every sector of the Mongolian education system. Now I'll pass it over to Julia to talk about our conclusion.
When discussing, next slide, please. When discussing our policy alternatives with the ministry's policy planning department director, she mentioned that forming an implementation department was the ministry's current priority. And although having a specialized team to monitor and support consistent implementation is crucial for an effective and sustainable education system, that team's success is dependent on accurate and efficient data collection, teachers' capacity, and collaboration and partnership at the local and school levels. Therefore, we end our presentation today by highlighting that the power and efficiency of reforms and the resiliency of any educational system requires collective action and shared beliefs amongst all stakeholders. Thank you very much for your time and opportunity today.
Thank you so much. Let's now hear from Dr. Faryal Khan, who is a dear former student, a graduate of our doctoral program, and a real education leader in UNESCO. Faryal, over to you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much. I would really like to begin with congratulating the team, the Mongolia team, for preparing a very robust paper and a very clear presentation. And thank you, Fernando, for inviting me to participate in this visionary conference. I really believe this is likely the first of its kind. I was thinking about it. I have not been to a conference where we've been looking at ongoing national reform efforts, and how they're aligning with recommendations of the Futures of Education report. So this is really a first of its kind. So thank you for this opportunity. Coming to your paper, I think the team has done a really excellent job, and there are already some areas of alignment between the ongoing reforms and what the report suggests. I think pedagogy, assessments, and curriculum are at the heart of the transformative education processes, and the ongoing reforms are already addressing some of these very key issues to ensure quality education, addressing issues of equity as well. But what I'm reading is that the Mongolian education system is facing a dual challenge of meeting, on the one hand, this unfulfilled promise to ensure that every child has the right to quality education, every child, youth, or adult has the right to quality education. And so this is already a huge challenge, and the reform is trying to address that. But then on the other hand, how can then the reform realize the transformational potential of education as a pathway for sustainable collective futures, where responsible and creative citizens learn to live together peacefully and sustainably. So these are some of the questions that I was looking at as I was reviewing the paper. And one of the things I felt was that the paper focuses on aspects of educational quality, data-driven, evidence-based, policy formulation and decision-making, issues of access, teachers, recruitment, leadership issues. But where I felt that to really harness the transformational power of education, we need to look at some of the ways how learners relate with each other, how learners relate with our planet, So there is the issue of the education for sustainable development and global citizenship education elements that come into the reform efforts. And I was not really sure if the paper, I think the paper can perhaps strengthen some of those aspects to unleash the transformative power of education to address some of the gaps. So it's not just about cognitive, teaching, skills, and but also looking at this living together peacefully and sustainably. I also saw that the paper paints a very vivid scenario of how political disruptions have disrupted education, and the Futures of Education report warns that breakdowns in civic discourse has consequences for an education that is rooted in human rights, citizenship, and civic participation at local and national levels. So I really like very much how you build around the issues of solidarity, and the paper suggests increasingly active citizenship mobilization across many areas. And I think this is really, this solidarity, collaboration is really the key to harnessing the transformative power, pointing towards the futures of education. So these counter movements, where there is a tension, because you're trying to enable collaboration, but then there are also political disruptions. And I felt that these counter movements are an opportunity for resilience and new futures for participatory processes in public policy as well. For example, in Mongolia, the paper suggests an increasingly divided political landscape, and which is why I thought the focus of the paper on people and participatory processes was very much in line with the transformative efforts of the reform. You also give a very detailed analysis of the local education authorities. You speak about 2 levels, the local MOEs at the provincial and the municipal level, and also at the district and SUM levels. And this again, this accountability at the district and SUM levels, I think this is an area where perhaps you can strengthen a little bit more, where capacities would need to be strengthened to enable the district and the SUM levels to really play their part to assure that accountability that the reform wants them to assume. And this strengthening capacity at the district and SUM levels, of course, one thing is, of course, the capacity development of the Ministry of Education officials, but then to strengthen links with the futures of education, this also enables us to look at, this has implications also for curricula. And this is when I was referring earlier to the role that education plays in encouraging a more democratic citizenship and creating deliberate spaces and participatory processes, collaborative practices, relationships of care and shared futures. So through the curriculum for the new generation, Learners can learn, need the values, skills, and attitudes to become proactive citizens who creatively address these challenges. So I think the political situation in Mongolia points to a significant need for deep learning to empower learners to become active citizens, going beyond the cognitive skills and cognitive skills, developing skills like interpersonal, intrapersonal, and ethical skills, and awareness of some of the global issues. Also valuing differences in opinion, because there seems to be political divides. So as they grow up, how they can participate in the political life of the region. And to do this, then teachers also would need to be empowered through training, curriculum, and teacher guides to support interdisciplinary discourse that is aligned with this, with the Sustainable Development Goals. Another thing I wanted to just mention is that the future is very dynamic, and sometimes we are using assumptions to make predictions, which are rapidly changing. And policymakers have to plan for multiple future scenarios which utilize the collective intelligence of the stakeholders. And I think your paper can build a little bit more on how the Ministry of Education plans to build resilience and also agility. Because look at what happened with COVID-19. We need to strengthen the resilience of education systems, and especially if they're undertaking reforms, how they can be prepared for unexpected crises in the future, perhaps. And for this, again, the data-driven and evidence-based approach, with SS being to inform evidence-based policy formulation, this, of course, would be a very big asset. And I think it's a very strong, I like very much your component on MS and the use of data. Another strand that I thought which was very strong in the policy alternatives that you recommend is the addressing this whole issue of teacher turnover and retention. And I really believe COVID-19 has given us an opportunity to gain an understanding of teachers' challenges, their expectations, and how they can provide, education systems can provide teachers the necessary support. So teaching can be further professionalized as a collaborative endeavor where teachers are recognized for their work as knowledge producers and as key figures who enable educational and social transformations. So I think that is a pretty strong area where, and I also like the, you're talking about the digital age, the digital divide, and efforts to address the digital divide. And an area where I had a bit of a challenge was, you speak about an implementation team or unit that is developed just with a very specific responsibility to monitor the implementation and, and quality standards. And I'm wondering if this is if this counters systemic capacity strengthening, at the systemic level, because you want to strengthen institutional capacities of the education system to monitor and implement the program, to monitor it. Would you be creating a parallel structure that would in fact be competing with the mainstream systems that are already in place? So my question is, rather than, and this is something for reflection, rather than having an implementation team which hires consultants or staff that come in, they zoom in and they do the work and they zoom out, could we not work on institutional capacity strengthening of the people who are there, and perhaps create twinning opportunities? But because otherwise there are questions of sustainability, and what is then the exit strategy for this implementation unit? So for me, this was a bit of an issue. This needs some reflection, and I'd like to hear how you feel this would not be counterproductive to strengthening the institutional capacities of the Ministry of Education. I do have a few recommendations. I don't know if I have 2 minutes more. Some recommendations. I believe there is a
maybe 2 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah. So very quickly, there is a readiness level to reimagine education. I think in Mongolia, the ongoing reforms are already aligned, and I think interdisciplinary research and analysis and foresight and public policy debate on pressing issues pertaining to quality and relevance of education can further strengthen that. So enabling education stakeholders to participate in such analysis and foresight could trigger innovative action that is shaped by different interest groups, and partners and stakeholders in Mongolia can perhaps be inspired to take action with other stakeholders and partners. And then finally, I would like to say that even the Futures of Education report itself, perhaps, why can you not use this in Mongolia as a platform for stakeholders to engage in public policy dialogue, to look at, to look ahead, to look at harness innovative action, to forge a new social contract for education, because they already have reforms ongoing, but perhaps have they seen the report? Are they using it? And has there been public discourse around this? So finally, the last point is you speak about collaboration in a very strong way. And I was thinking active engagement of partner organizations can also further bolster these efforts through either online or face-to-face community engagement platforms to engage stakeholders and to build informed consensus. And youth networks. Youth are real change agents. So I will end with that. It would be really great to see how you bring in youth to mobilize their networks and to enable innovations so that you can really, they are the future, and how do then they participate in the decision making as we move forward. So I hope this is helpful.
Thank you so very much for this careful reading of the paper, for these thoughtful questions and suggestions, which I'm sure I'm going to be very useful to the team as they revise this chapter. In the remaining 3 minutes, I'll ask them to address some of the questions you raised and perhaps some of the questions in the Q&A. And to those questions you don't get to answer, you can answer them in writing in the Q&A. Go ahead.
I will kind of elaborate on the idea of the implementation team that was put in the report. Through our discussions with the policy planning department director, it was something that was asked specifically. They are in the process of designing a new department for implementation purposes, and we did have an ongoing discussion with her about that it could potentially create more barriers. And so that was something that we have discussed and raised. And so because it was so important to them, we wanted to highlight it in the report. And through our research, we came across a couple models that with a small specialized team to help, actually the goal would be that this team helps monitor the implementation, but really helps support the agencies and government departments to increase their institutional capacity to then do it on their own. However, I do appreciate what you brought up as well, because it was a concern for us too. And we don't have the answer, and I would love to continue to deep dive into it and learn about how to increase that type of capacity.
And thank you so much for all the great questions in the question Q&A. And one of the questions that I thought it's interesting is that it's asking about the teacher recruitment. Do they have high school apprenticeship program right now? If not, what is their current recruitment method? I think you really pointed out the real one of the big challenges right now in Mongolia, where right now it's the baby boom is happening. By 2030, we going to, the secondary school students will be increased by 70%. That means we will need more schools, and then the teachers' capacity needs to be doubled. So definitely for the recruitment method at this moment, Mongolia have this scholarship program where students who have higher scores in their entrance college examination, they usually got the scholarship. And then also they do have scholarship for male students who enter into the teachers' colleges, but those programs were not that much. I mean, it increased some numbers, but then it wasn't really fully successful because there was no strategic model where what's going to happen with the students when they graduate after. Are they going to be really teachers or not? Like, are this the students who are really passionate and motivated to become real teachers? That's the problem that they didn't really think of. So in our policy alternative, we suggested that there should be this, high school students apprenticeship program where we try to solve both quantity and quality. We were thinking about like different solutions, but then this apprenticeship program will really help the students who are in the high school and who are interested to be teachers can have opportunity to really have this teacher field experiences in their own high schools, first of all, with the exemplary teachers, and also, develop their leadership skills through community projects, maybe some like, teaching after school programs related to the education or teaching, So with having this program, we are making sure that, the students who are entering to the Teachers College will be motivated, passionate, with the right disposition, can go to the Teachers College. So eventually they will be becoming real teachers who are passionate and who will make changes in the world. So that's how we come up with the policy alternatives for that one. And I think we are running out of the time, but like I would really like express our sincere gratitude to all of the audience, and then especially to Professor Reimers and our great Fael for the great encouragement and feedback. It has been an extraordinary journey for our team to work on and support amazing reforms of Mongolian education system. And hopefully our work has pointed out some ideas to think and consider for the reform that aligns with the Futures Report. And our team would be more than happy to continue to work on the project as well. And just, to end up this conversation, that I would just to express that, at the end of the course, I understood that, when we talk about the policy or reforms, it's all about collaboration and partnership. So, and then I think Mongolia is doing exactly that. So I hope this current reform objectives can truly be implemented with the support of everybody and together. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful way to end, because that is very much the spirit of UNESCO Futures of Education, that if we're going to transform education, it is going to take the kind of collective leadership that the collaborations that we see in this conversation can bring about. So thank you so much, Faryal. Thank you for this team. We're now going to turn over to the next presentation, and we're going to have another one of these cross-generational dialogues among both students and graduates of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And so the next team is going to talk about addressing the reforms ongoing in South Africa through the lens of UNESCO's report. And our discussant is going to be Dr. Jordan Naidu, another distinguished graduate of our school who's gone on to have an extraordinary career, first in UNICEF and then in UNESCO. We're so glad you're with us, Jordan. So without further ado, over to Catherine and Sirak.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon and good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to present. As Professor Reimers said, our team will be presenting our analysis of South Africa's basic education system in conversation with UNESCO's report. Next slide, please. So before we present our analysis and recommendations, we'll start by outlining some of the biggest challenges facing the South African basic education system. First, although it's been 27 years since the end of apartheid, there's still widespread structural inequality in South Africa's education system. Roughly 25% of public schools are performing well, while 75% are performing poorly. There are also broader challenges like poverty and malnutrition, which result in the need for extracurricular support for learners' well-being. The inequalities in the system are then reflected in initial teacher education, which varies across institutions, and a lack of high-quality teacher professional development. In terms of language, while most children learn in their mother tongue from kindergarten to grade 3, they transition to English as the primary medium of instruction in grade 4 without adequate support. These and other factors play a role in persistently low learning outcomes, both in foundational areas like literacy and numeracy, and in broader social, emotional, and cognitive competencies like critical thinking. Next slide, please.
To address these challenges, we conducted a literature review of the South African education system and of educational approaches in other countries. We also collected data from interviews with key stakeholders in South Africa, our meetings with the NECT, and a survey of teachers from 10 South African schools. Next slide, please. To deal with structural inequality, the post-apartheid government introduced reforms, such as allocating funding more equitably across schools and forming school governing bodies that are made up of principals, teachers, parents, and students. The Department of Basic Education, DBE, also works with a large network of civil society organizations. The country's National Development Plan prioritizes education, and the Action Plan to 2024 includes goals, policies, and large-scale programs to support vulnerable learners. One program is called Care and Support for Teaching and Learning. This creation of school governing bodies and partnerships with teachers' unions and civil society organizations is a means of collaboration across the education ecosystem, an idea UNESCO speaks about. The Care and Support for Teaching and Learning program takes a holistic approach towards childhood development, accounting for a child's physical, socio-emotional, intellectual, and psychological needs. Next slide, please.
There have been multiple initiatives to raise teacher quality. So to address gaps in teachers' content knowledge, there have been some promising programs in public schools that use a structured pedagogy approach with teacher training and coaching. To enhance the status of the teaching profession and address variable teacher quality, the South African Council for Educators, or SACE, established a teacher professionalization path and national professional teaching standards. These initiatives align with UNESCO's call to reimagine teaching as a collaborative profession, where teachers, school networks, professional organizations, and universities can partner in solving challenges. SACE's teacher professionalization path highlights roles that different stakeholders can play in teacher development. They also have a requirement for novice teachers to participate in induction programs, which aligns with UNESCO's ideas on collaboration across teaching generations. However, there's limited opportunity for South African teachers to collaborate beyond their own schools. In terms of curriculum and pedagogy, as we mentioned earlier, most public schools teach in African languages until grade 3 and transition to English in grade 4, although the language policy allows for a later transition. There was also a curriculum revision between 2012 and 2014 to address challenges in educational quality. This new CAPS curriculum is a content-driven system, which replaced a more outcomes-based curriculum. More recently, the department has announced that it intends to introduce a curriculum with skills and competencies for a changing world to address the evolving needs of the future. Many of South Africa's language policies support UNESCO's vision in acknowledging the importance of mother tongue instruction and Indigenous knowledge systems, but there's an opportunity to strengthen implementation. Similarly, although the CAPS curriculum has contributed to improvements in foundational learning, there are opportunities to be more deliberate in fostering the higher order cognitive skills and social emotional competencies outlined in its vision statements, which align very closely with the vision in UNESCO's report. Next slide, please.
So we have 3 recommendations that address the needs of teacher education in South Africa. One structure that can fix the one-size-fits-all nature of current professional development and use professional learning communities, PLC, that already exist in many schools is the lesson study model. This is a teacher-led collaborative approach that groups teachers from the same subject area or the same grade level. These groups develop research lessons in an iterative process. Recent literature on professional development in South Africa highlights teachers' desires for PD choices that specifically address their needs in the classroom.
And results from a pilot of this lesson study model in South Africa showed that teachers' practices improved, and teachers reported that lesson outcomes were achieved. Because this model relies on collaboration, lesson study supports a re-envisioning of teaching as a joint endeavor within a community of educators and specialists, which is in line with the recommendations provided in the UNESCO report. Our second recommendation re-envisions the teacher as a teacher researcher, where they have the option of participating in school-based research. This type of integration requires the formation of two types of school-based groups, a research team and a planning team. The research team would consist of content teachers who develop and gather research for their school's needs. The planning team would be a micro version of the research group, consisting of teachers that are in the same content and grade level, who would meet to pool resources, examine student progress, and plan lessons together. This planning team would be housed in currently existing professional learning communities, where lesson study groups would happen. At the national level, this re-envisioning opens avenues for teacher advancement through 3 teacher pathways: a leadership track, an expert teacher track, and a specialist track. A 3-ladder career track, which is also found in Singapore's system, can raise the status of teaching and prevent the best teachers from leaving the classrooms. And our third recommendation seeks to strengthen the alignment of theory and practice during initial teacher education. In an apprenticeship model, teacher candidates would spend a majority of their initial teacher preparation in classrooms rather than the university. This benefits schools that lack human resources for small groups and tutoring, because teacher candidates can fill this gap. Overall, these 3 recommendations seek to improve school systems, namely teacher quality and development, teacher accountability, and teacher status. Next slide, please.
The next 3 recommendations relate to curriculum and pedagogy. First, the DPE acknowledges that the curriculum implicitly contains many of the competencies needed for success in a changing world, but most teachers lack the tools and support to teach them deliberately. The DBE has been working with the NECT and others to start drafting a competency framework for infusion into this curriculum. We recommend that the work continue and that the DBE take a collaborative approach to co-create a vision for the future of South African education by involving key stakeholders like provincial departments of education, districts, unions, school governing bodies, universities, and civil society organizations. The dialogues could proceed in phases using the draft competency framework and later a logical framework and draft curricula as points of departure for discussion and iteration. We'd also recommend that detailed multi-pronged support be developed for teachers and other implementers of the reform in the form of materials and aligned professional development opportunities. Second, given the success of structured pedagogy programs in South Africa, we recommend that these programs continue to be developed and expanded in line with the planned curricular revisions. We'd also recommend that they incorporate approaches that provide differentiated support to meet student needs, such as teaching at the right level, or TAL. TAL is a foundational skills intervention that has had positive impact in India and sub-Saharan Africa. There are currently TAL pilots being run in South Africa with promising early results, and we would recommend conducting a rigorous evaluation of these interventions. This recommendation aims to support learners who are promoted without the competencies to succeed at the following grade level, and it allows for greater personalization of learning. Lastly, we recommend that the education system expand current infrastructure to provide mother tongue instruction for the first 6 years of schooling within the existing language policies and make English compulsory as a first additional language. In alignment with the principles of the UNESCO report, this policy enables the preservation of Indigenous languages and knowledge. From a human development perspective, it also promotes multilingual language acquisition as it facilitates early exposure to different languages and provides continued support for speaking both languages. Thank you so much for your attention throughout our presentation. We invite any comments and questions that you might have.
Thank you so much to this wonderful team. We're now going to hear from Dr. Jordan Naidu, who I believe is with us right now. Is that right? Can we stop sharing screen so we can see Jordan? There you are. Over to you, Jordan. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Fernando. First, let me thank Fernando for inviting me to be part of this very exciting and necessary conference focusing on policy and implementation across such diverse contexts. And then thank you very much to the group. This was really good for me personally to reconnect with my past. I worked intimately on some of the issues that you raised almost or more than 20 years ago in the early 90s up to about 98. And it was interesting to see some of the kind of recommendations that you are making that have in some ways been made before. So it will be interesting to see how your recommendations are translated in practice. And I think back to, Sutton and Sutton's book with Bradley Levinson on policy and practice, and their ongoing statement that policy is practice. And so what I want to say first, I think your analysis of the historical trajectory of change in South Africa is very cogent and really identifies some of the key bottlenecks in policy implementation in South Africa that remain to today. The second point I want to applaud you for is that you've taken on quite an ambitious task in trying to address, what many would say are intractable problems in South Africa. So I'm glad you've taken on this challenge, but at the same time, I have identified some key issues which I think will require further attention in your paper, and I hope I can continue to dialogue with you on that as you think about publishing. Firstly, in terms of the connection with the UNESCO report, I think you've identified key areas that link to the main recommendations of the UNESCO report. And I think the areas that are really significant that you highlight are built around this question of a new social contract. My question, which I will raise at the end, is how different is the social contract that's being proposed now from the social contract that was envisaged both in the new constitution in 94 and then in the Schools Act in 96? What are the key differences in that new social contract? And what are the new assumptions that have been made relative to the theory of change that informs your recommendation? That's the first. So just to look at the recommendations, the 6 or 7 key recommendations that you highlight, I think they are very relevant. The focus on a new competency-based curriculum framework, structured pedagogy, transitioning to English, later than the current grade 3, the focus on teacher professional development and not just remaining limited to professional development in the traditional approach that has been used in South Africa, but linking it to this issue of career pathways and teacher conditions more broadly. I think that's a significant shift. But again, and I'll come to this later, is what is different, because some of this has already been proposed. I remember the discussions within SATU almost 15, 20 years ago did raise this issue of pathways and new conditions of service. And then the question of dialogue. And I think what is important, and I really want to applaud you again for that, is that you do look at this question of expanding dialogue through a phased approach. And I will pick up on that concept of a phased approach later as well. And I know there's some kind of challenge around a phased approach, especially when you think about the pressures that political appointments face from their constituencies. Everybody wants everything now. So a phased approach goes totally in the face of demand. So let's look at, oops. I hope you can still hear me. Sorry, there seemed to have been a short break. So I think, one of the central points of your recommendations cohere around curriculum, pedagogy, and teacher quality. And I think the way you phrase the recommendations may lead to some short and medium-term improvement. However, I have some doubt about the systemic and longer-term impact. And for various reasons, and some of the reasons are linked to the inherent challenges, structural challenges that exist within South Africa, both in the education system, but more broadly. And I think, Catherine, you alluded to that in your introduction, that some of the structural inequality is so entrenched that just some tinkering with the system is not going to help. So I think that's one thing that you have to look at. These reforms that have been made for almost 30 years now have failed to have the desired systemic impact for a number of reasons. And I would identify two significant sort of barriers or bottlenecks for the failure of many of these reforms. And I think the reforms that are being currently suggested and the recommendations you make may come up against those same bottlenecks. So in the paper, I think there needs to be a little more attention to these two areas. One, I think there's been a consistent lack of strategic leadership. Many of the former ministers, senior officers, and so on have been colleagues of mine for a number of years. And I hope they will take this criticism in the spirit that it's given. There has been, a lack of consistency in this leadership and in the efficient management of the reforms. Constantly, the way the reforms have been dealt with, there have been these ad hoc, knee-jerk responses to critiques and to the results coming out of, TIMS and PISA and so on. And reforms usually are implemented for a year or two, and then somebody suggests something new to the minister, and a new reform is instituted. So hopefully, with the NECT and the leadership of Godwin Khoza, some of the reforms that are being proposed now and the recommendations you make will be given a longer shelf life and chance of success. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point, I think, where I have some issues with the recommendations, I think the core recommendations are excellent. It's a matter of how do you mitigate some of the bottlenecks that will arise in implementation. And this builds off my first point. I think these 6 or 7 recommendations do appear somewhat piecemeal. How are they linked to the broader overall policy? And the larger context of South Africa is not clear. And linked to that, many of these reforms, as you've stated, Tal, some of the teacher reforms have been pilots. They have worked in a very small context. I think the big question for South Africa is how do they work effectively and successfully at scale? And I think at scale, taking account of the vast differences that exist both within provinces and across provinces. Many of the recommendations I can see would work perfectly to some degree across the entire province if we look at Gauteng and Western Cape. But for my own home province of KwaZulu-Natal, given the differences, say, between the Durban metropolitan area and the north, the Nkandla, the really poor, vulnerable districts in both north and south, I see major challenges in implementing the reform. And unless there's some kind of affirmative action for the most vulnerable provinces, these reforms will have little traction. So that's a second point. Going back to the futures, I think the future state is really important in terms of its emphasis on looking at not just education as a black box, linking the changes that we make in education to the larger need for social, political, and economic transformation. And this is something, was a commitment in the Constitution in '94. And South Africa has struggled to really make such transformation in the wider society a reality. And in fact, some would argue that over these past 27 years, many of the structural inequalities have actually widened for a number of reasons. So unless some of that is addressed, and I know education cannot be held responsible for the wider transformation, but it is a key contributor. We have to see these changes concurrently, both within the education sector and in the wider society. And the two-way interplay between the wider changes and I want to go back to, you've rightly concentrated on teachers as a key wedge for change. However, some of the previous comments around language transformation, around, I think the comments from Isaac earlier and even from Pariel also point to the fact that we do need to look at the wider context and how that links. And the role of these actors that we see in the social contract. I think there's some kind of assumption that everybody involved in the social contract, whether they are teachers, whether it's the business sector, political appointments, and so on, have, are in it, in the contract in a magnanimous way, contributing without any vested interest. So I think if we do not take into account the vested interest of the different parties and how do we manage these interests in a way that contribute positively rather than negatively, is something that you need to consider a little more in the paper. I think there's a limited time, but I'll just take a minute or two if that's okay, Fernando.
Absolutely, maybe another minute.
Yeah, one of the things that I think Catherine mentioned already is this question of a two-tier system. And I think unless South Africa deals with the two-tier system, where they, inheriting the legacies of apartheid and the ex-Model C schools and the 25% of high-performing schools and learners, is linked very much to privilege. It's linked to the economic background of the students. It's linked to a number of other benefits and resources. And unless that divide is addressed, we are going to continue to get any reform failing in the large majority of schools. So I think one question there, and even your paper alludes to some of the research. If we take any analysis of PISA or TIMSS or even national exam results, you will clearly see that the top 25% of performers would be performing well in any exam. They are much more, they have the resources, and this comes back to teachers. I like the whole issue of teachers as researchers, teachers of creators of knowledge and creators of pedagogic practices. But again, we have a system where teachers, their initial capacity is so variable that may work with these advantaged schools and not with the majority. There was some work done in a neighboring country, Lesotho, 25 years ago by Ward Ennefort and local Lesotho academics on a similar kind of curriculum and professional development program. It worked well, even in a small country like Lesotho, but it was never scaled up. So I come back to the question of scaling up. I have many other comments, but I'll just conclude. Again, to thank you very much. I think you've made some real key recommendations, which could work, but my sense is largely at the pilot level. The same with, TAL and the structured pedagogy, go back to Isaac and the others. The majority, if we just say they need only basic skills and we can deliver it through structured pedagogy, I think we are creating a second-class citizen relative to those that are given a broader learning experience. I know it's fundamental that we instill foundational skills, but those foundational skills have to be addressed together with the other skills necessary to survive in an uncertain future. That's one. The second point, I am reiterating this question of scale and phases. So I would ask that you, or recommend that you do more on that. And finally, the question of mitigation measures to address structural inequality. I'll be glad to continue the dialogue with the group, and I'll send you some more detailed comments on the paper. Thank you very much.
Jordan, thank you so very much for that extremely careful read and this very thoughtful feedback, which I know is going to be invaluable to this team as they revise this paper for publication. And thank you for making yourself available to continue the conversation offline. So at this point, I'll turn it over to the team and ask them to make concluding comments in just 1 minute. And I know that there are some questions on the Q&A, including from our distinguished alumni, Shirley Eddy, who works in South Africa, who's been following your work, but I will ask that you respond to them online, okay? And so maybe 1 minute.
Thanks so much. I think we're all just really appreciative of the time that Dr. Naidu took to go through our paper, and he's given us a lot to think about, and we would really, really appreciate the chance to engage further with him and think about the paper more broadly. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you so very much. Well, at this point, we're going to turn it over to the next team that is going to present an analysis of ongoing efforts in the state of Nuevo León, Mexico. And I know that only some members of the team are here. One of them is actually in Mexico, working with the Ministry of Education, kind of in a follow-up of this work. We are delighted that the discussant for this paper is going to be former Secretary of Education of the state of Puebla and AGSC graduate of the International Education Policy Program, Patricia Vasquez, and perhaps the current Secretary of Education, Sofia Leticia Morales, another graduate of the school, will be able to join us. She's in a meeting right now with the governor, so I'm assuming that that meeting ends, she will join us. But for now, let me turn it over to Natalie Jordner, Fatima Isas, and Ari Wiesel. Go ahead, Natalie.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation. I'm Fatima, and I'm here with my team members, Natalie, Ryan, and Ari. Our project was with the state of Nuevo León in Mexico and centered around educating the whole learner and every learner. The structure of the presentation is going to be that first we'll run through a diagnostic analysis of education issues in Nuevo León, then present a proposed theory of change in alignment with UNESCO's Futures of Education, and finally, we'll present our recommendations. Next, please. From our diagnostic analysis, we found 4 key challenge areas. First, there was generally low enrollment at most levels, but poorest for children aged 0 to 3, which was 7%. Next, please. The second issue that we found was poor learning outcomes in basic arithmetic and literacy with high failure rates at upper secondary. The failure rate was around 24%. Next, please. Third issue that we found was student well-being, which was at risk with issues such as bullying, violence, and involvement in criminal activities, and a significant increase in rates of home-based violence during the pandemic. Next. Finally, there are capacity issues characterized by budget constraints, presence of unlicensed institutes, and poor building infrastructure, which became worse during the pandemic. Next, please. So based on these challenges, the current administration's reforms can be explained through the following theory of change that centers the learner through reforms in early childhood care and education through socio-emotional learning and assessments. We'll speak about this in more detail in a little bit. Next, please. From the UNESCO's levers of change, 2 levers are most relevant for this theory of change. First, the transformative work of teachers that focuses on developing teacher capacity and having teachers as participating in the research process as well. And the next is education across different times and spaces. In alignment with these levers, we propose the following theory of change. Next slide, please. To educate the whole learner and every learner, a strong developmental foundation should be built through early childhood care and education. Resilience and 21st century skills should be built through socio-emotional learning, and personalized learning should be advanced through data-responsive pedagogy so every child learns and finishes school. And through this, we envision that the student, caregiver, teacher, and school leader all are simultaneously envisioned as learners. Next slide, please. So first, we're going to talk about interventions and current initiatives in expanding the use of socio-emotional learning in the state of Nuevo León. There are two major levers to this, to the reforms. First, there is training. There is an optional training that the state has made available on socio-emotional competencies for all K-12 school officials and teachers through the existing civil society organization Atentamente. And the second initiative is integration of socio-emotional competencies in the curriculum across different subjects and developing it as an individual subject as well. Through the training, however, 70% of teachers are expected to be reached. 30% are still, they're not expected to be reached through this training. Next, please. These reforms are also in alignment with the Futures of Education's call to provide opportunities to foster empathy, ethics, compassion, and building the capacities of individuals to work together to transform the world. Our policy recommendations in the socio-emotional learning area span two broad areas. First, reaching and providing support to all teachers, and second, building capacity of principals so they can better support teachers in their schools. Within the first recommendation, we recommend the use of TPD at scale model to reach all teachers and effectively all students. TPD at scale is a content-focused professional development program delivered via online and face-to-face modalities that enable participation of large numbers of learners without necessitating physical co-location. To provide implementation support to teachers, we recommend using a combination of coach and TPD at scale to introduce in-school professional development and peer learning support. For principal support, we are thinking of providing professional learning communities for principals, so they're able to collaborate with other principals, and the existing Atentamente structure can be leveraged for this. Finally, we are proposing the use of actionable school-based school improvement projects that are tied to specific socio-emotional competencies that the principals can design and implement in their own schools. I'll hand it over to Natalie to talk about the rest of the recommendations.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So thank you, Fatima. Next, we'll be discussing initiatives that address coverage and quality in early childhood care and education, or ECCE. So Nuevo León's governor aims to promote ECCE and has launched a campaign with the slogan that Nuevo León is the best place to be born, raised, and educated. One of the state's initiatives in this area involves evaluating federal initial education centers and pursuing accreditation for the existing formal and informal daycares and for their staffs. So this includes mapping out these centers and matching infrastructure projects to the needs that they identify in each community. Another current initiative involves partnering with LEGO to provide professional development in play-based pedagogy for formal daycare providers and for promotoras, who are locally hired volunteers that make home visits and serve as early childhood advocates. Finally, the state is partnering with higher education programs that train daycare providers to implement a competency-based framework for future daycare providers. However, the state has not yet found a way to train the currently employed informal daycare providers in these competencies. These initiatives clearly echo the Futures of Education's report's call for quality early childhood education so that learning, growth, and development of all children are attended to from birth on. Next slide, please. So to bolster these efforts, our first recommendation is for advocacy campaigns targeted for families to promote understanding of the importance of early childhood education. This can be done via SMS text messaging based on a model called Tips by Text. While a similar program does currently exist for smartphone users, SMS messages could potentially target more families who lack consistent internet access, but a cost-benefit analysis is needed to confirm this. Next, we suggest a community-based parent education program using the model from the organization Bebés Más Fuertes, which involves hosting free sessions for local caregivers that focus on literacy, socio-emotional learning, and responsive parenting techniques. This program could specifically target 3-year-olds in the state, and when piloted in another state of Mexico, 100% of participating families enrolled their children in preschool upon completing the program. Our final recommendation in this area is to use the previously mentioned TPD at scale model for professional development to extend training for non-accredited daycare providers based on a competency-based framework. This would avoid pushing out the non-credentialed daycare providers by offering them a cheaper and more convenient training model that doesn't require them to return to school. Next slide, please. Next, we'll turn to the topic of establishing purposeful assessment systems and responsive pedagogies. So education officials have currently implemented a teacher-led version of the oral and adaptive assessment called the Independent Measurement of Learning, or MIA. And this assessment has been delivered by volunteers in students' homes in other regions of Mexico, but has been adapted to be given in schools and via Zoom in Nuevo León. As our diagnostic noted, initial results have shown significant learning loss since the pandemic. So to address these gaps, officials have adjusted the school timetable to reserve every Friday for ability-based academic interventions that are aimed at catching up struggling students, but there is not currently a standardized structure for teachers to use during this time. Additionally, teachers have begun trainings in formative assessment methodologies, and officials are developing a holistic statewide standardized assessment system. This set of reforms also aligns with the Futures of Education's report by recognizing students as unique learners who can benefit from personalized support. Next slide, please. Our first policy recommendation in this area is to assess out-of-school students by employing promotoras to expand the MIA assessments to the homes of students who are neither in school nor connected with educators via online communications like Zoom. This can serve as a touch point to reconnect children with the school system and help get data to support them when they do return to schools. Next, like the South Africa team, we recommend implementing teaching at the right level, or TARL pedagogy, for one period of each day. TARL is an evidence-based, cost-effective method for grouping students by ability and targeting each group's needs through adaptable and hands-on pedagogy. Our final recommendation in this area is to implement a two-tiered strategy that can promote summer learning. The first tier is READS, which is a simple, adaptable, and evidence-based program that supports home-based summer literacy, and it can be implemented to keep students and their families engaged in literacy over the summer. The second tier is more targeted toward vulnerable students who can opt in to attend a volunteer or promotora-led math and literacy summer camp, which is taught using the previously mentioned TARL methodology, in addition to play-based activities, and these camps have been successful in other regions of Mexico. Next slide. We want to thank our contacts in Nuevo León for their help and support throughout this project. Thank you so much, and mil gracias.
Thank you so much. So we now are going to invite Patricia Vasquez, former Secretary of Education of the state of Puebla and graduate of our school, to be the discussant of this paper.
Thank you very much, Professor Reimers. I'm so happy to be here and so happy to be joining this session from this early morning. I
just see, Patricia, that Secretary of Education of
Yes.
Nuevo León, Sofia Leticia Morales, is with us, and I'm delighted that she was able to make it. So let's hear from Patricia and then from Sofia Leticia. And she's joined by Ryan Herman, who is one of the members of the team who wrote this thing. So it's wonderful to see this connection across geography, across different generations of graduates of the school. That's great. Go ahead, Patricia.
Totally, I totally agree, and I'm going to be very concrete so Secretary Sofia Leticia can do her statement and her comments on this. But I want, first of all, to congratulate Fatima, Ryan, Natalie, and Ariane for this extraordinary work. I think that you have the chance to work with another extraordinary human being, Sofia Leticia, and she's just beginning a new government, a new period. So that is so like that match of extraordinary students plus having a very good decision maker next to you, it was like the best match. So I wrote like 5 concrete points that I want to address. And first of all, I want to outline how you manage to connect all the partnerships that Nuevo León has started to push forward to bring together for the educational policies in Nuevo León. I think that matching, bringing Mia into the conversation, bringing Atentament into the conversation, bringing obviously Armando Estrada is very well, like there's a threshold during the paper that is very well connected. And I really appreciate that from the standpoint of being a reader. So that's a very good thing that I want to point out. The second thing is that you managed to connect the challenges and the agenda that the Secretary Sofia Leticia wants to address with the challenges of the COVID. So, so it's not easy to begin a new government, but I think that you manage also to be very concrete about, yes, although these challenges are here and this is the agenda, it is wonderful to put that agenda in the midst of the COVID and the pandemic times, which is not very easy to accomplish and to address. The third thing is, obviously, the policy recommendations are very well detailed and very well, how can I say, but very well like addressed in terms of what the government need to read from the standpoint of a paper like this, because this is an academic paper. And when you want to like address something or give something back to government to whom you have been working or you want to work with, it's very important to give to them policy recommendations that they can take away very easily and very practically. So I think that you did it very well. And from the standpoint of the scope of the research, I think that there's a huge opportunity to keep on unpacking best practices for each one of the policy recommendations. I think that something for the governments and a subnational government as a way it is in Nuevo León, it is much better as you can unpack and bring more best practices from other parts of the world. I'm thinking more best practices on early childhood. I mean, you know, you have Sophia Letizia, she's a very well-experienced woman and a very expert in education, but even though she's now taking decisions and she's now like in that moment in her life, but bringing more policy recommendations from other parts of the world to each one of the statements that you've made can be very and much helpful than the way we have done until now. So a recommendation for you is if you can unpack more practices and bring more other experiences, not only from Mexico, but also from other parts of Latin America and the world, can be very convenient for a government as Nuevo León that is just beginning. And a very last comment, because I think I have to leave so many time for Sophia Letizia to make her comments, is I think that the challenge for this team is how you're going to convert this paper into a policy paper. I think that's something that you can do very easy, and I think that you have the opportunity, the content, the engagement of the government, is how you bring all this amazing information, this wonderful research, and obviously the comments and the recommendations that we are all giving to you, how you're going to build a policy paper, very concrete policy papers. So from the sense of the decision maker, I mean, you have the time to read a paper in 10 minutes. What are the things that you want? I think that you did a great presentation. I think from that presentation, you can build this very one executive summary paper. But I think that, and it's very important to be translated into Spanish someday. But I think that as long as you connect theory, study, research with practice, it's going to be more useful. So also the Secretary of Education of Nuevo León can use that as a reference for her future decisions that she's going to make. So I'm going to stop there because I think that I really like the paper. Congratulations for you. I don't want to get more involved into other aspects that I think I will give the time for the Secretaries of Letizia, but congratulations. And you have a huge responsibility to convert this, again, I want to reinforce my idea, into a very concrete, simple, but very thoughtful and engaging paper for anyone that can read more about that. You're muted, Professor Reimers.
Thank you, Patricia, for the careful reading of that paper and that useful feedback. It is such a pleasure to welcome Sofia Letizia Morales Garza, Secretary of Education of Nuevo León, who I have known since we were both students at the School of Education. And we've had a relationship since, a very satisfying relationship because Sofia Letizia is a generous friend. I'm sure we all meet people in life who have a very transactional view of relationships. It's all about how can this help me? Sofia Letizia is all about how can I help the school? How can I help others? And I appreciate how generously she opened the doors of the secretary for this team of students. So without further ado, Sofia Letizia, I'm delighted you're here. And I know you had to cut a meeting with the governor short to be here. So I especially thank you for that.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I don't know if I need to. I think it's have been really a pleasure and also a learning experience to be part of this class. I consider myself also another student. I learn with them and for them, and in some ways together. I will say my comments is that they did, I agree with Patricia, a wonderful job. They were always open to suggestion. They were able to have a dialogue and conversation with different actors so that almost at the same time that I was constructing some programs, they were able to interview the different actors and say, well, what they are offering to Nuevo León in this moment. So I think it's a wonderful paper. I agree with Patricia in that we should transform this into a policy paper that will include some other ingredients in that sense. My comments will be related with, in some ways, to some of the points of the UNESCO, the Futures of Education, Reimagine Our Future Together. The first thing is that with this work, we underline and prioritize the importance that we have reason to be full of hope, because in that way we were able to be connected and to analyze the problems together, even if they were in Cambridge or in any other place in US, or we were here in Monterrey working with the same problems, trying to find different alternatives. I think part of the issue that we need to go further is how we can transform education with these suggestions. I agree with the 3 levels, 3 main projects, and I agree with them because in some ways, especially the early childhood education, fulfill the criteria of being a priority for the state. Has the political will at the higher level. The government and his wife were able to launch this project a week from taking the position of governor, and with this idea that Nuevo León need to be the best place to be born, raised, and educated. And in that sense, taking that as a priority, we, together with this team, we are putting all the apples in the same basket. How can we improve early childhood education in Nuevo León? But not just from the educational point of view, but also working together with social inclusion, with health, with the different ministers that they are part of the cabinet of equality for all people. So in that sense, the big challenge in every project at the state level is how to work together with the other ministries or with the other secretaries. And we have that in early childhood education. We have almost weekly meetings with the other secretaries of the different, even from culture, the Secretary of Culture and the Secretary of Violence Against Women, just to analyze how to work even with the teen pregnancy as a part of this project.